And so what we see is not necessarily a tension between good and evil, light and dark, heaven and hell, thwarting angel and demon, but instead an ordered cosmos, one that is working in harmony.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so excited to talk about Jinn, angels, and the Islamic esoteric tradition with Professor Ali A. Olomi. Now, Dr. Olomi is a historian of Islam and the Middle East with a specialized focus on esotericism, magic, folklore, and astrology. He's an assistant professor of history at Penn State Abington, and his work explores how Muslims imagined the Islamic world through the intersection of religion, science, and empire, and how Muslims in the pre-modern and modern world deployed the concept of homeland to etch the borders of empire, construct collective identity, and imagine the other. Dr. Olomi is also the host of the excellent Head on History podcast, which you can support on Patreon, which explores Islamic history, current issues, and culture. And in addition to all of that, I firmly believe you cannot go on Twitter and search for Islamic esotericism, jinns, or astrology and not come into contact with Professor Olomi's incredibly elucidating, engaging, and comprehensive Twitter threads on Islamic astrology, folklore, jinns, angels, and many other topics. In other words, especially for listeners who are familiar with grimoire esotericism, ceremonial magic, and lore, Professor Olomi is the perfect person to ask about the deep influence and wealth of wisdom in the Islamic esoteric tradition, the role of angels and jinn in magic, and the massive influence Islamic esoteric engagements has had on the European grimoire tradition, and also Dr. Olomi's thoughts on how we can build bridges of understanding and appreciate the esoteric cross-pollination of various tributaries. I also want to thank each Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your listener questions for Dr. Olomi, which, as usual, were excellent. Dr. Olomi also urges us to break down barriers and misunderstandings between esoteric traditions, the amazing practice of calculating personal planetary hours in the Islamic tradition, as well as key things to always keep in mind when considering the jinn and angels in the Islamic tradition. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Professor Ali A. Olomi. Professor Ali A. Olomi, thank you so much for coming on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure, and thank you for that kind and gracious introduction. I hadn't realized how long my bios on my various websites were until you started to read them. I'm like, I definitely need to streamline that.
Absolutely not. I could read that all day. And the honor is certainly mine, Professor Olomi. Some people say you had me at hello, but you, Dr. Olomi, had me at, oh my goodness, these in-depth Twitter threads on Islamic esotericism are amazing. So thank you so much for just taking the time. Certainly know you're so busy. And can you share with us a little bit, Dr. Olomi, about your early background, especially for someone like you who is so erudite and so prolific? Did you have an early exposure to spirits and the supernatural?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think it speaks to the origin story of any academic who really gets into this. All of us who work in esotericism, magic, occultism, have a fascination with these things. These are subjects that inspire us, that interest us. It's the spooky, the scary, the hidden, the unknown that really kind of draw us. But there's always a personal connection. No one really studies a subject as much as we like to pat ourselves on the back in the academy for being quote unquote objective. We all have a personal connection to the things we study to some degree. And I think anyone who's grown up in a Muslim background has had some experience with the jinn. They know somebody who knows somebody who's encountered the jinn. Oh, my cousin that one time, or oh, my uncle. You hear about the uncle who disappeared because of the jinn, or so-and-so whose house is haunted. So everybody has some type of encounter. And I'm certainly no exception in that regard. But I also have a family connection to esotericism. My family has been deeply involved in these subjects. I have great-grandparents who were deeply involved in Unani, which is a type of herbal indigenous healing tradition. in the Persianate world. It combines Greek and Arabic knowledge. It's rooted in sort of the Ibn Sina's idea of medicine, but has deeply spiritual components to it as well. So I have evidence of like historical archives and physical objects. Like from my great grandfather, we have a talisman that he made decades and decades ago for a client or for his family. Personal spiritual objects and whatnot. So there is a family connection. And so quite early on, I've been exposed to a side of Islam that may not always be talked about in the mainstream. And that's been my impetus in many ways in the academic world, is to explore something that I'm deeply related to, I'm fascinated with, I'm interested in, and I'm a big believer that if you study something you genuinely enjoy, then it's not really work. It's sort of a fun hobby that you get paid to do.
From everything from your great-great-grandfather making a talisman, from kind of being ambiently immersed in these mentionings of, jinn and angels and spirits. Can you share, Professor Olomi, to that exact point, when did this first interest for you specifically start, specifically with exploring jinn and angels and the more esoteric aspects of Islam? Was it one moment, or did this kind of slowly evolve over time?
Yeah, it definitely slowly evolved over time. There is the sort of formative experience as a child, growing up hearing these stories, these legends, lore, knowledge that's sort of passed down. What happens if you have a cough? What prayers do you say? Watching, my grandmother treat things like nausea, hearing stories about various angels, the stories of the jinn. That was part of my formative experience. And then I would say there's a sort of second stage that happens, and this is sort of the post 9/11 moment. For those of you that have seen my image, don't be fooled by my shaved head. I'm actually a lot younger than people expect. So I'm of the generation where 9/11 is my entire life. Like I grew up in the backdrop of 9/11. And in that post moment, what I saw was a conversation about Islam that really sort of reduced Islamic tradition into really either security matters or a legal tradition. This is what you do. This is how long you grow your beard. This is a very sort of simplistic understanding of Islam, both by Muslim public figures as well as people from the outside, pundits and whatnot. This is what I call the burqas and beards spectrum, where Islam is really just sort of reduced into a series of legalistic proclamations. Muslims need to do this, and they need to do that. And then in the more broader context, it's always within some type of security framework, national security, whatnot. And this didn't vibe with the Islam that I had heard about. It didn't quite connect with the things that I was reading, what I was learning, the family tradition, my friends' traditions, the lived experiences of ordinary Muslims. And so that became the impetus to take what was originally sort of the formative experiences of my childhood and take that into an actual academic research. So what do the sources say? What do the texts say about these various entities, these various ideas? What is the role of science in Islam? What is the role of esotericism in Islam? Is this just all heterodox weirdos on the margins, or is there something there? Is there a tradition that we're not talking about? And that's where I started to really dive in academically, particularly once I got into college, into cosmology, the jinn, angels, the intellectual tradition of Islam. And that offered an opportunity to kind of enter into areas and regions of this study that aren't always talked about. It helps to present a more lived experience of Islam. And so far, that's worked out quite well. It has been an interesting dive, and obviously my interests have evolved and grown. I see myself fundamentally as a historian of Muslim thought. I'm interested in how Muslims imagine the world around them, what that says about them, what that says about the others, the way that Muslims imagine the heavens and their geography. And with that comes a deep appreciation and study into the esoteric tradition, the occult tradition, the philosophical debates, a sort of experience of Islam that goes beyond jurisprudence, that goes beyond simple reduction to laws, regulations about how to be a worshiper, but more about what did these Muslims do in the 9th century? Well, how did they live in the 10th century? If they had labor pains, was there a prescription that they gave? If they experienced fear or anxiety, how did they experience it? Just recently we were talking about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions that happened in December of this 2020. And there was all these articles that were written about it. And it's fascinating because those same anxieties, those same fears of a changing world, of a cosmos that maybe has an impact on our ordinary everyday life, were things that you could find in the 9th century. So this was a way for me to really broaden our understanding of Islam and really interject a different perspective that goes beyond that very simplistic spectrum of regulation, rules, legalistic prescriptions.
As you were uncovering these esoteric practices and texts and examining the history, how acceptable, quote unquote, how tolerated or embraced is the idea, the practice of esotericism in Muslim majority countries? Because I know that, for instance, in post-Protestant America, we always see on streaming shows and whatnot that there's a very false dichotomy of everything is either incredibly evil and from the devil, or it's all holy and sanctified. Can you share with us about how acceptable it was to discuss and is to discuss esotericism?
This is a great question. And it really goes to, I think, a problematic understanding of esotericism. So the issue here really comes down to the idea of magic. This is a term that we often use to describe any sort of supernatural phenomenon. But in actuality, the word magic, as we use it today, would not be too familiar to the people of the ancient world. Magic, as we kind of understand it, is a series of spells or supernatural abilities, only refers to something very, very specific in both the Islamic world, even in the Hellenistic world and the Mediterranean world. Generally a sort of malefic power. That's generally what magic refers to. In regards to supernatural abilities, there's a broad category that exists, and that's part of esotericism, occultism. And in that instance, we find a great deal of acceptance. The problem is that the language we use, magic, complicates the discussion. So if you were to ask a Muslim today, how acceptable is, say, magic in the Islamic world, there's going to be some tension about, well, what do you mean magic? No way. That's forbidden. It's taboo. But if you were to say, hey, do you know any talismans for easing labor pains? Oh yeah, of course we know a talisman for labor pains. Do you know a particular prayer in order to bring about a prophetic dream? Yeah, we know the prayer for that. There's a sort of complication here when we use the word magic. If we start to just look at it as a broad tradition of esoteric or occult knowledge, then it's actually quite widespread. It's pretty acceptable for most of Islamic history. We often forget that Islam really spread throughout the world as a result of esoteric preachers. It's the Sufis who spread Islam more than anyone else, contrary to the sort of spread by the sword mythos. If you look at the largest Muslim countries in the world, no Muslim army ever stepped foot there. It's always, if you look at Malaysia, Indonesia, parts of Africa, these are predominantly spread by Sufis who worked miracles, who knew magic charms about, and talismans and prayers and various healing practices. So I would argue that the esoteric tradition is very close to the heart of Islam itself. Secondly, we have to acknowledge that the intellectual tradition of Islam viewed all of this knowledge as part of a holistic body. That if you were studying geometry, you were also studying astrology. That if you were studying medicine, you were also studying talismans. And so the great scientists of the Islamic world were also talisman makers. The great jurists of the world were also astrologers. There's not really a great contradiction there or a real tension. In fact, as some people might be surprised to find out, Imam Ghazali, one of the most prominent orthodox thinkers, if you will, many historians of Islamic thought will argue that he in many ways furthered orthodoxy more than anyone else, was one of the chief prescribers of the 3-square magic square for labor pains. No contradiction there, no tension there. Of course you would prescribe a magic square in order to heal someone during a labor pain. So there is this real anxiety around occultism or esotericism. It's simply an understanding of the world. It's a product of a particular moment in which scientific thought, and we can call it scientific thought really blossoms in the Islamic world. And this scientific thought is about examining the ordered universe. There's a classification for animals. There's a classification for plants. Of course, there is also a classification for the cosmos. And those cosmos reflect back on Earth. Minerals that are poisons, minerals that heal, plants that are poisons, plants that heal, and of course, words, letters, things that are all associated and corresponding to one another. The only real kind of pushback we see, and we should be clear, when I say pushback, it's quite minimal. There is no inquisition in the Islamic world in regards to this. There is no burning people at the stake, hanging people, any of that at all in Islamic history when it comes to occultism. But what we do see is in the 19th and 20th century, colonial modernity introduces a particular definition of science that moves away from this older holistic understanding of science as part of a body of wisdom traditions. Science being related to all sorts of aspects of life, alchemy, astrology, chemistry, all related to one another. Science is now defined along technological terms, modern terms. And it's in this moment that we'll see a serious pushback on occultism and esotericism as no longer scientific, as something that exists outside of this modernist definition of knowledge. This isn't just an epistemological shift. This is a real structural shift as well. One of the things that we see in a lot of these colonial endeavors is the introduction of institutions of licensing. To be a practitioner of something, you must be licensed. And that will remove the wise man, the wise woman, the people who learned through family traditions, through transmission of knowledge, and instead will introduce the technocrat, right? And this is why if you ever ask anyone from Middle Eastern background, what type of job did your parent want you to go into? Doctor, lawyer, engineer. That's the colonial forms of knowledge, right? These three is where you can get your license, and this is how you become, that's where social mobility comes from. And so occultism will be pushed back as a result of this. At the same time, these modernists will also work hand in hand with the reformers. These are generally charismatic preachers that will emerge, Deobandi in South Asia, Wahhabism or Salafism in Saudi Arabia, who will define or try to create a monolithic Islamic intellectual tradition that they are imagining. It's an imagined pure tradition that stretches all the way back to Muhammad and therefore conveniently invests them with authority. They are the custodians of this, when in actuality, Islamic intellectual tradition is immensely diverse, immensely complicated. It takes centuries to develop. There's a great deal of flexibility, a great deal of disagreement that is considered totally cool. You disagree with me, I believe something else. Not a big deal. And so you have these two kind of forces that work simultaneous to one another. Colonial modernity and a reformist Puritan tradition that really pushes back on esotericism and occultism. That said, this is happening at the top level. In the lived tradition of ordinary Muslims, esotericism and occultism is still a real thing. It's a living tradition. You can find practitioners everywhere. I've traveled the Middle East. I've been to India. I've been to Pakistan. I've been to Afghanistan. I've been to Morocco. You go to these places, you will find practitioners who are still plying their craft, who are still versed in the old textual occult tradition, as well as the living tradition that they generally inherited from their family. So this is a living tradition. It's still part of popular Islam, even as the discourse changed as a result of these two forces at work in the 19th century.
To that point, Dr. Olomi, as you mentioned, when exploring the complexity, when exploring these kind of heterodox relationships, I remember on a previous interview, you mentioned Lughat al-Arabiya, the Arabic language itself is very complex and it's very subtle and it's very poetic. Can you kind of lay out, Dr. Olomi, some of the different broad classifications of magic, quote unquote, in Islam? Previous guests have mentioned there's a difference between sihr, for example, and what we find with Harut and Marut and Surah al-Baqarah versus Ruhaniya or Quranic theurgy.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And you're right. The language here is crucial. The word sihr means sorcery. And that's where we see the most kind of invective and polemics against. Sihr is a problem. And sihr refers specifically to magic that is malefic, magic that causes actual harm against somebody. That's where you see the majority of the sort of taboo. In regards to actual spiritual practices, you don't have the same tension there. And so ruhaniya is the accurate word for it, where it literally means the practice of spirit or the spiritual sciences. But also ilm is another one, just the knowledge is how it's referred to. Or hikmah is another very common one, meaning wisdom, all considered part of it. There are the idea of the ghaib, the hidden knowledge or the occult knowledge. It's certainly also there as well. So there are a variety of different terms that are used to refer to a broad range of spiritual practices. But I think the division between sihr and ruhaniya is an accurate one. Now, Ibn Khaldun gives a further classification. He says that there are sort of three types of magical power. The first of which is a mental type. This is a power that is directed. It requires no agency. It requires no intermediary. You're able to directly influence, bend people to your will, bend reality to your will. These are people who are able to sort of exert it. In this, he places things like the evil eye, the ayn, right? The eye falls into this. You're not casting spells. You're not saying invocations. The eye alone can cause change. The gaze alone can cause some type of change. Then the second category is talismans or magic that requires some type of intermediary. So a rock or a lamp or minerals or some type of talismanic object. This is where there's some type of intermediary that is required. It may be an invocation or prayer of some type. And then the third is imaginative or phantasms. This is the ability to create illusions and whatnot. He then further divides all of this into three categories. He says that there is natural magic. Natural magic is the magic of astrology. It's the magic of minerals. It's the magic of herbs and plants. And we find a similar designation in the Ghayat al-Hakim. In the Latin is referred to as the Picatrix. That is the aim of the wise, right? Or the goal of the sage. We find this idea of the natural magic, astrological, herbal, mineral, etc., talismanic, all falls under natural magic. Jinnic magic, this is magic of the jinn, in which you work with the intermediary of spirits specifically. So you invoke some type of jinn to carry out an operation. And then letterist magic, that is the magic of the esoteric knowledge of words, symbols, the very building blocks of the cosmos. And that's considered by many of these writers as the most spiritual form of power here, or the most spiritual form of occult power. It involves a deep learning of the mysteries of creation and therefore allows you to participate in the reworking of that creation through invocations, through prayers, magic words, letters, etc.
Wow. Okay. So given that immense amount of complexity and the different classifications of magic and practicing esotericism, can you share, Dr. Olomi, about the incredibly important role of Solomon or Suleiman? We have so many listeners who are familiar with quote unquote Solomonic magic, but what actually in the Islamic tradition is the role or the relationship between Suleiman and spirits and perhaps using jinn to help build the temple? I think people would love hearing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Solomon is the prototypical mage in the Islamic esoteric tradition. And this comes directly from the core texts of Islam, from both the hadiths and in the Quran itself. Solomon is said to have been granted wisdom, that he had some type of wisdom, and as a result of that wisdom was able to control the jinn, control the powers of this world, and he employed that in the service of God and his empire. He built the temple with these jinn. And so we can find that the Quran itself mentions magic in very ambiguous terms. It's not forbidden in any, it doesn't say magic is a bad thing. There's just really kind of three references. There's a Solomon reference, there's the Moses reference. Moses's big kind of appearance in the Quran is part of a magical contest between him and the magicians of Pharaoh. And then there's a sort of reference at the end. There's an invocation of protection where one of the lines basically says, protect me from those that blow on knots, that is curses. So there isn't any real clear injunction. In fact, Solomon's wisdom is then taken as evidence by occult thinkers and esoteric thinkers of, okay, there are some forms of magic that is considered godly or divine, granted by the divine, and Solomon becomes the prototype from it. And so as a result, we will find in a variety of these esoteric traditions an attempt by magicians and mages to recreate the items of Solomon, specifically the khatam, his seal, the ring that he wears, and the staff that he has. And as a combination, if you can recreate it, you then will be given dominion over the world of the jinn, of the hidden. And this comes with all sorts of corresponding powers. They will then become your servants. They can build things for you. They can carry messages for you. They can carry you on the wind. Solomon is in many ways the originator of the magic carpet mythos. He is the first to sort of fly among the air, and it's described sort of him flying on a massive canopy or a massive carpet of some sort. He's able to transport himself and his court. and his throne. They're able to bring things to you. Quite famously, the jinn promised to bring the throne of the Queen of Sheba, though in this instance he actually chooses his vizier to do it rather than the jinn. They grant a level of power, but you have to be able to recreate the ring and the staff. And there are legends of what happened to the ring. Does the ring still exist? Is it out there in the world? And there is a sort of Shia tradition that Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of Muhammad, he became the inheritor of the ring and is said to be the last person who had the ring of Solomon. But there is a variety of different traditions that will try to recreate the Solomonic ring and as a result, hopefully gain power over the jinn. So there is a deep connection here between jinn, Solomon, talismanic objects, and the Islamic esoteric tradition.
So for all those listeners out there who might be familiar with later, much later European grimoires, for example, but they have things like the Seal of Solomon or the Ring of Solomon. You're saying, Dr. Olomi, this goes right back to that tradition.
Origin is always hard to do, right? We're never, because dating is a little bit funky, and there's also the issue of oral traditions. But as far as I can tell, the Ring of Solomon in the Islamic tradition may predate the Solomonic tradition in the Western esoteric tradition, where we find the Seal of Solomon and the brazen vessel and all of that. It may possibly be a sort of drawn from, perhaps, the Islamic esoteric. These things are also possibly existing at the same time, and there's probably some cross-pollination. But the Islamic and Jewish esoteric tradition of Solomon may have been the precursor and perhaps the inspiration for the grimoire tradition, which then brings it within a medieval European Catholic cosmology. But this older idea of the ring, it exists in the Islamic tradition, which in turn they likely got from the Jewish tradition, right? The biblical scriptures talk about the Ring of Solomon. There is a rabbinic tradition about Solomon, his ring, Ashmodai, who usurps him, makes its way right into Islam. Ashmodai simply becomes Habakkuk or Sakhar, and he's a jinn rather than a sort of demonic figure. But the same thing, he steals Solomon's ring. He's able to kind of usurp his power for a short period of time. That comes from the older rabbinic tradition that's borrowed in Islam. So there is a great deal of cross-pollination that's going on.
Okay, so that leads right into something that is very central, obviously, to Islam when we think of Jibreel and angelic influence. Can you share, Professor Olomi, about how and why were the angels created in the Islamic tradition?
The angels are crucial. There are three intelligent races that are created by God. The eldest of these races are angels. Each one of them is created from a different substance, a different essence. Mankind or humanity is created from clay, from earth. Angels are created from light, nur. And there's debates over what this light really is. And so there's all sorts of exegesis and commentaries. Does it have heat? Does it not have heat? What type of light is it? But it's considered an extension of God's light. They are created and they are the maintainers of God's cosmos. They are the ordered celestial bodies. In the Islamic cosmology, everything is ordered. With God at the top sitting upon his throne, all of the universe, everything in creation is then organized under the guidance of these angels, which are carrying out God's will. They're an extension of his will. There's a sort of beautiful, fascinating description of them as entirely harmonious to God. There is this idea here that the angels don't fall. They don't have free will. There is no war. There is no cosmic battle in Islam. God is in charge of everything. This goes back to the central idea of Islamic theology of Tawheed, the unity of God. There is no dualism. There is nothing challenges God. God is a complete and total center of it all. He extends his will out and all of creation is created. There is nothing else beyond that. Angels, therefore, are the extension of that will, the extension of that light, and they are in a constant state of worship. Everything they do glorifies God. There is a cosmic harmony, a buzz, a vibration of constant praise of God. And in that harmony, there is no discordant tone. There's nothing that falls outside of it. Everything, as they act on their nature, is in perfect harmony, worshiping the Creator, worshiping the Lord. There's actually a really beautiful sort of commentary that talks about how many angels there are. They say the heavens actually creak under the weight of how many angels there are. So there is a lot in Islamic angelology, we can call it. And it is also one of the most misunderstood and most overlooked aspects of Islamic cosmology. People sort of assume that there's not an advanced angelology like we find in the medieval Christian tradition, and so therefore angels aren't that important, but they're immensely important. The idea is that the entirety of the universe is filled with angels because God's light is everywhere. There's no shadow, there's no dark, there's only light. And that's this very beautiful understanding of God, his creation, and where the angels sort of fit into that. Even in terms of hell, the angels are in charge of that. There's no demons who run hell or the torturers of hell or the custodians of hell are angels. They're God's hellhounds. They're God's hell's angels, right? They exist. They're called the Zabaniya. They're referred to in Surah 96 and 66, if I'm not mistaken, if I recall correctly. Yes, Surah 96 and 66, the Zabaniya. Then there's a variety of angels that are also not even heard of in the Western tradition. So the angels play a central role in the cosmology. What they do is they order the universe. They exist in a sort of hierarchy, all working in concert, in unity to carry out God's will. They're in a constant state of vibration, a constant state of praise, a constant state of action. They're moving in between the realms. So life is about the expansion of this light and how it reaches everywhere. The angels are the embodiment of that light.
That is such a beautiful, beautiful explanation. And I love that very poetic analogy about heaven's Jannah just creaking with the presence, just swollen with this amazing celestial presence. And Professor Olomi, you just answered a Patreon question we had from Damien about, in the Islamic tradition, are there any fallen angels? Definitely not, as you say. This leads, Dr. Olomi, into a question. I know in the esoteric tradition, in some of the European grimoires and kind of here and there, there's a concept of thwarting angels or angels that can bind or control lesser spirits. And I know that your research and your Twitter threads really, I think, do an excellent job of laying this out. But can you share with the listeners on this concept in Islam, for example, about angels binding or in charge of other spirits?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thwarting angels, as in the sort of Solomonic tradition, doesn't quite exist in the Islamic tradition, in that there isn't an equivalent to every angel. There isn't a hellish equivalent to every angel. There isn't a sort of evil demon shadow to the angel, or an opposite that we often find, right? Ashmodei is ruled by a particular angel, and so on and so forth. Instead, what we find is a hierarchy that is in harmony, a celestial hierarchy, that there's angels at the top that order the cosmos, and then under the angels, there are subservient jinn who are kings in their own right. But they are gross, they're a little bit more gross matter, right? They're a little bit more physical. Not fully physical, but a little bit more physical. And so these jinn then in turn have tribes of jinn that serve under them. And so what we see is not necessarily a tension between good and evil, light and dark, heaven and hell, thwarting angel and demon, but instead an ordered cosmos, one that is working in harmony. So Mikael, the angel of Wednesday, rules over Barkan, and in turn, all of them are ruled by a sacred letter, Ze. And this in turn is associated with a certain day of the week, Wednesday, which is then associated with a particular planet, Mercury. And we find the same thing for Saturn. Saturn and Saturday is ruled by Kha, and Kha in turn has dominion over the angel Azrael. And in turn, the angel Azrael has dominion over the Jinn king Maymun. So there is a way in which this hierarchy exists where it's all in a line, all serving and rising up to God and in turn descending into the mortal realms. This is deeply tied to a sort of Neoplatonic understanding of an Aristotelian world. There is a chain of being that exists. There is a celestial plane, the plane of angels, the plane of spirit, the plane in which God creates directly. And then there's a sublunar plane, which is governed by the lunar mansions. And so the angels then transmit God's light through the lunar mansions into the sublunar world through the agency of the Jinn kings, which then have an effect on the material world through the four elements. So this great chain of being becomes central to Islamic cosmology, and at the heart of that Islamic cosmology is an ordered universe with angels and spirit at the top, followed by the jinn, who then have an effect on the material world.
Wow. So this, Dr. Olomi, leads right into a listener question we have from you, from Maria, who is saying, "Hi, Professor Olomi. I love your informative tweets, and I'm excited you're on Glitch Bottle." Maria says, my question is, many grimoires from Europe detail working with angels only, instead of just using them, say, to bind spirits, such as the angelic grimoire, drawing spirits into crystals, or the Ars Victoria. And so Maria's asking, Dr. Olomi, can angels be engaged with in this manner in Islamic esotericism?
Absolutely. Thank you for the kind comments, Maria, and thank you for your question. Yes, they absolutely can. You can invoke angels directly. Not all esotericism revolves directly with Jinn. There's very famous examples of talismans. One of my favorite talismans is a love talisman, in which just the 4 archangels are invoked in a magic square. So there's a magic square in which a series of secret letters and numbers are written, again, associated with this corresponding hierarchy that I mentioned. And then in the 4 corners of the talisman are written the 4 Sultan al-Malak, the leaders of the angels, the kings of the angels, what are called the archangels, Mikael, Jibrail, Azrael, Israfil. And so there is a way of working with them directly, both through talismanic magic as well as through prayer work. There is a series of sort of dream traditions involved in which you invoke through prayer and fasting the angels, and they will appear to you in your dreams in order to answer questions or grant blessings. But there are also direct petitions to them, direct prayers and invocations that we find, long, long petitions, mostly through the 4 archangels, but other angels also appear. So there is a tradition where you directly work with the angels, their names, either through talismans or invocations, where they will appear either in dreams or in other sort of magical experiences of communication. Even sort of scrying, they do show up in sort of scrying traditions. So they do exist. Not everything is Jinn magic. Most people, in fact, would probably be saying, I'd rather work directly with the angels. The angels of light, they're obviously going to be more powerful when it comes to granting my petitions, if maybe perhaps the Jinn may be more sympathetic. So there's a whole tradition of working with angels and invoking them. We find great examples in prayers as well as in talismanic objects. I'm going to probably share. In fact, actually I have. I've shared one of these talismans that has the names of just the angels on them, and it's used specifically for love, to draw love.
Given this kind of focus that many esotericists in the Islamic tradition can have with angels only, this brings up something that is talked about a lot on online forums or practitioners, which is the concept of the holy guardian angel, or the HGA. And can you share with that? Because I think many listeners are familiar with the HGA and 18-month rituals like the Book of Abramelin, which details, incredibly complex instructions or at least a very long time. Does the concept of the holy guardian angel exist in Islam? And can you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. It's slightly different, not in the HGA concept, the holy guardian angel concept, though I should say the Book of Abramelin the Mage and his techniques are not too different, I should say, from some of the Islamic traditions in Ruhaniya. The idea of fasting for long periods of time, prayer, purification is pretty similar. We find almost identical rituals and operations in the Islamic tradition. The holy guardian angel as a singular entity, less so. Also, the holy guardian angel as sort of your higher self. We often see that in the HGA language, right? Particularly the Crowleyan tradition, the true self, right? That true self concept isn't quite there. Instead, we find it in 2 different traditions. So the first tradition is the idea of companion spirits. It does exist. The Quran mentions a variety of different entities that are then associated with humans. There are angels that watch over humanity to ensure that they meet the sort of fate that they're destined towards. They protect them from early death. They protect them from early harm. They guide them. They're meant to be sort of literal guardians, custodians of the individual. They're generally considered to be 2 of these angels. Some say 4 or 6. So there's some debate there. Then there are the recorders, 2 angels that record all the deeds of humanity. They sit on the sort of prototypical good angel, bad devil on your shoulder, but they're both angels. And they write the sort of deeds of humanity. They are then related to another concept known as the Qareen. The Qareen is a jinn companion that humans have that exists with them. This Qarin, also known as a Hamzad in the South Asian tradition, is a sort of doppelganger that exists, a Jinn doppelganger that exists in a hidden world. This is the inverse of what we could say of the Holy Guardian Angel, right? A sort of daemon spirit that exists, a little bit of a tempter, a little bit of a corrupter. But then there is a separate tradition that is much more aligned with the idea of the Holy Guardian Angel, and that is the concept of ruh, or spirit. In Islamic cosmology, the human soul is divided up into parts. It's not a singular soul. So in many ways, it may reflect some of the older Egyptian ideas, the Ka, the Ba, and what is it, the Khabit or the Thabit, right? The multiple divisions of the Egyptian soul.
Yes.
We find a similar concept in Islam. There is the nafs, which is the sort of base soul, the animalistic soul. It's not evil or wicked or whatnot, but it is related to the ego. It is the soul. It is the human consciousness. It's the thing that we all experience. And there's ways of purifying the nafs. The nafs is deeply related to things like dreams. Certain egoistic dreams, erotic dreams, for example, are associated with the nafs. But all humans also have a ruh, a spirit. And the spirit is this higher spirit that connects them with the divine, the thing that uplifts them, the sort of angelic nature of humanity. The ruh is then connected to the cosmic ruh, which is the angel, the highest angel in angelology, according to some. Of course, there's some debate here. Khazwini writes in his Wonders of Creation that it is the highest angel. The angel that is sometimes referred to in the Quran as Ruh al-Quddus, the Holy Spirit. This Holy Spirit is a sort of breath of God, the light of God that exists at the divine celestial highest realm, and in turn is related to the angel of the moon, which is Jibreel, who is also known as the Holy Spirit. So again, we see this idea of the angels descending through the moon and then into the material world. We have that same concept with the soul. The ruh above, that is the angel, connects humanity to the divine. It is that divine expression, the angelic expression of our spirit. It manifests vis-a-vis the Holy Guardian Angel or the Holy Angel or the Holy Spirit into the material world, into what becomes the nafs. It is embodied into it. This is explained deeply in a sort of astrological terms in which the soul actually goes through these different spheres. There's the imaginative sphere, the natural sphere, the rational sphere, these various different spheres that then manifest in the sublunar world. And that connection between the celestial and the sublunar is ruh, spirit. This is what I would say is the similar concept to the Holy Guardian Angel. The two are deeply related in this way. This higher angel that then manifests as our individual higher spirit that then is embodied in the nafs.
Okay, yes.
It's a very complicated, I know, long answer.
No, that is beautiful. That is absolutely beautiful, Dr. Olomi. Thank you so much. And you just mentioned a few moments ago Jibreel as well. And we have a listener question for you from Lauren, who is asking on something that you touched on as well, which is, can Dr. Olomi share if Islamic esotericism has planetary days, which you've touched on, but also planetary hours? Lauren says, I have a practice where I work with the 7 planetary archangels in the European grimoire context. So for example, Lauren says, I work with Gabriel or Jibreel on the day of the moon, Monday, on the hour of the moon, the first hour of the day or sunrise. And then she says also you can work on the 8th, the 15th, and the 22nd hours. So Lauren's asking, Dr. Olomi, how does Islamic esotericism treat planetary days and hours?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Thank you for that question, Lauren. And I would say, where do you think the planetary hours and days come from? The tradition of the planetary hours and days is likely an Indic and Hellenistic origin that is synthesized in the Islamic and astrological tradition and then transmitted to Europe. This is one of the clearest examples we can see of the astrological tradition influencing Europe. It's mentioned in Abu Mashr, it's mentioned in Al-Buni, it's mentioned in the Ghayat al-Hakim. Planetary hours, planetary days. Then those texts, particularly Abu Mashr and the Ghayat al-Hakim, are translated into the Latin tradition, which then becomes part of the Grimoire tradition. That's where the planetary hours and days come from. Very important. They're used 3 ways. Some of these ways are lost, and some of them are used in the Grimoire tradition. The first is it's used in astrological interpretation. Planetary hours and days is found in Mashallah, in Nisal, and Abu Mashr, a variety of different ones that say you must note what planetary day and what planetary hour an individual is born in. And that can tell you something about that individual. It's a building of testimony. Okay, so the most powerful influence in this person's chart is Mercury because they're born on Wednesday. They are born in the day hour of Mercury, and Mercury is dignified in the horoscopic chart. So that tells you something. So it's used there. It's also used in interrogational work as a way of divining the intent of somebody. So finding out if someone has a secret question. This was very common. Caliphs would test their astrologers and ask them, I have a question in mind, but I'm not going to tell you the question. Can you figure out what I'm thinking about? And so they would cast the horoscope. And one of the ways they would look at is the Dodekademoria, the 12 parts, and the planetary hours and days. If they ask within a particular hour, that tells you what they're thinking about. Oh, this is in the hour of the moon. So they're obviously thinking about lunar things. And there would be a series of correspondences that would be associated with that. Then they are used in talismanic works in very much the way that you've described here by organizing magical activity, spiritual activity based on the planetary day or the planetary hour. Both Buni and Ghayat al-Hakim give detailed instructions on various talismans, and almost all of the talismans. Most famous love talisman from the Ghayat al-Hakim is when Taurus is rising or when on Friday during the hour of Venus. Very clear instructions there. So planetary hours exist there. There is a third way that still exists in the Islamic tradition, but does not exist in the Western Grimoire tradition. And these are known as the personal planetary hours. A unique horoscope is cast with a series of special calculations to determine the lucky hour of an individual. Which planetary hour is their special planetary hour? This is different from the hour that they're born in. So you might be born in the hour of Mercury, but the hour of Venus is your lucky hour. And then those are used to create specialized talismans for you. This personal planetary hour, I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think makes its way into the Grimoire tradition. It ends up getting lost, but is still part of the Islamic esoteric tradition.
Okay, that is so fascinating, Dr. Olomi, because yes, I don't believe that is in the kind of Western quote unquote grimoire tradition, but that's such a great point. So what you're saying is like someone out there might say, oh, I'm a Capricorn and I was born in the hour of Saturn, but you're saying, no. If you do your personal planetary hours, that could be a totally different hour than what people think.
Exactly. So the surface level is just say I was born in the hour of Saturn. That's good, right? That tells you some information, right? But the whole idea of astrology is that you want to get into the like really nitty gritty, right? The contrary to the sort of sun sign astrology or popular astrology, ancient astrology gets into the nitty gritty. So that's why we have these micro divisions of the zodiac, the Duodecadamoria, the 9 parts, all these sort of different aspects to it. Same thing with the planetary hours. It's about getting to the nitty gritty. Okay, you were born in the hour of Saturn, but what's your real lucky hour? Maybe it's Venus, maybe it's Mercury. And so there's a whole set of calculations that are done, similar to sort of the Arabic parts, finding a sort of sensitive time or sensitive moment. And you're like, okay, you may have been born in the hour of Saturn, but your lucky hour is Venus. That's when you should be signing your contracts. That's when you should be making your talismans. Because that will unlock your fortune.
Wow, that is so fascinating. Yes. And I really hope the listeners appreciate that much as I do, because that is just really shedding some needed illumination on the tradition. Professor Olomi, too, just a few moments ago, you mentioned kind of the 4 archangels, for example, the 4 prominent ones. And we do have a listener question for you from Wilma, who is asking, hi, Professor Olomi, thanks so much for the great work you do. Can you help me understand how the Archangel Raphael is treated in Islam? Wilma's asking, is Raphael the same as the angel of Sunday, who in the Arabic tradition is called Ruqa'il, or is Raphael the angel known in Arabic as Israfil, who will blow a trumpet to announce the day of resurrection, Yawm al-Qiyamah? She says, I'm a little confused between Ruqa'il and Israfil. Thank you, Professor Olomi.
Thank you for that fantastic question, Wilma. Yes, this is a great one. Raphael is an example of how sometimes, while there is a great deal of overlap between the angel traditions in Islam and in the sort of Christian tradition, that there are some angels that just don't make it over, right? There's just some differences there. Raphael is one of them. There is a debate. Most Islamic scholars and theologians argue that Raphael is Israfil, that functionally that's the angel. There is a smaller, minor intellectual tradition of esoteric tradition, which says it's Ruqayya, the angel of Sunday. It does exist, maybe both. But Raphael, as we know him as the sort of healer angel, isn't really a major part of the Islamic tradition. He's replaced really with Israfil. And the vice versa. There are angels in the Islamic tradition that don't make their way over to the European tradition, right? For example, the angel Malak, who is the angel of hell. I call Malak the unsmiling, because there's a very famous story about him when Prophet Muhammad had his night journey and he ascended into heaven. He went through each of the heavens, meeting angels, and each of the angels greeted him warmly and smiled and were excited to meet him, except for Malak, who Muhammad was actually quite scared. When he saw him, Malak would not smile. And so there's this very famous line, all the angels in heaven smiled upon meeting Muhammad, except for Malak never smiles. And that's because he's the angel of hell. And so Malak the unsmiling, I call him, does not make his way over to the European tradition, right? Similarly, Azrael, the angel of death exists, but Azrael, the name, is mostly a rabbinic and Islamic name. It exists there, sort of kind of percolates and pops up every once in a while in there, but certainly isn't associated with, say, for example, the planetary power of Saturn. I think Saturn is Casael, if I'm not mistaken, is the angel in the sort of European grimoire tradition. Whereas in Islam, it is Azrael. So there are some angels that they don't quite cross over. Raphael is one that's sort of maybe connected to Israfil, but we're not sure. So this is a really great example of, yes, there's a lot of cross-pollination. Yes, there's a lot of exchange going on, but there's also an element of uniqueness, of things that exist within the Islamic tradition that don't exist in the European tradition, and things that exist in the European tradition that don't exist in the Islamic tradition. And Raphael might be one of them.
Given all of this amazing focus on angelology and the importance of angels in Islam, what are 2 or 3 things that you wish people understood a little bit better about angels in Islamic esotericism? I think one thing is definitely, as you touched on at the beginning, that they play a huge role, much more than people might think. But is there anything else that you think people might misunderstand, or things that they should keep in mind about angels in Islam?
As you rightly point out, that one, they play a massive role in the cosmology of Islam. But 2, that people kind of assume that Islam doesn't have an advanced angelology because the angels don't quite exist in choirs, and that maybe Islam doesn't have angelology, but it does. It has a very advanced, nuanced, complicated understanding of angels, and they exist in their own hierarchies. They're not choirs, but they certainly exist in celestial spheres. They're divided among the heavens. So angelology does exist in Islam. It is particularly important. Even though the Quran sort of makes elusive references to them, they show up in the outside sources, both in the hadith, in the commentaries, in the various theological works. There's whole texts associated with angelology. Suyuti's text, Samarkandi's text, all deep delve the angels, and they have some beautiful descriptions of angels with thousands of heads and countless tongues that praise God, and all sorts of beautiful, complex ideas about angels that do exist. The big takeaway is that the angels have no free will, that angels are an extension of God's light, and therefore they cannot fall. They're incorruptible. The light cannot be corrupted. There's no concept of, for example, the shadow corrupting light. These things are not equal in Islamic cosmology. Evil is not equal to good. Darkness is not equal to light. Light will always obliterate it. Light extends, it expands. And this is the sort of heart of Islamic angelology, that they are an extension of God's light. They do not fall, and they carry out the orders of the divine unerringly without fail.
That, Dr. Olomi, is so beautiful. And that is a perfect segue into from angels who do not have free will, who execute the kind of divine commands and spreading light all over the universe and through creation, to beings, aside from humans, that do have free will and who are perhaps going against the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this opens up the conversation about jinn in Islam. Can you share with our listeners, Dr. Olomi, about Iblis? Who is Iblis, and the creation or the kind of genesis of the shayateen or evil jinn, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think it would suit us to start first by saying what the jinn even are, and then go into the shaitan. So the jinn are a form of alternative life that are simultaneously spiritual and living. And this is very important to understand, that they are not just spirits. That's one way to understand them. That's just one way. But they're also just alternative life, long-lived living beings that are invisible, a different type of life that exists alongside humanity. They likely predate Islam and were perhaps the tutelary deities, spirits, local entities that existed in the region, but become co-opted as the second intelligent race in cosmology. The first are the angels, the second are the jinn, and then finally humans. So the jinn are said to predate humans and originally are said to be the inhabitants of the earth. Now, how do we know this? The Quran makes a sort of random reference in Surah Barakah, the second surah, verse 30. God says, I'm going to create humans. And the angels go, will you create a being that will spread bloodshed and corruption on the earth? And it just kind of leaves it there. And God goes, I know what I'm doing. Shut up, right? I got this under control. But it leaves the question, how do the angels know that this creation will spread corruption? Are they seeing the future? No, they're talking from experience. And the commentaries, which we find in Al-Tabari and elsewhere that expand on this, say that God initially created the jinn and they inhabited the world. There's some debate on who the original jinn is. Some say the original jinn was this guy named Iblis. Some say it was a jinn named Jinn. Others say it was Samum. Samum is a sort of scorching fire. Some will say that it's actually just a force. Others will say that no, it's an actual jinn itself. In the medieval tradition, it will become associated with fevers and plague and whatnot. But that from this jinn, sort of countless tribes then emerged. And these tribes lived on the earth, and some of them spread corruption and some of them were goodly. And the goodly jinn were led by an entity named Al-Harith. And Al-Harith reached out to the angels. Oh, angels, oh God, please help us. These jinn are messing up the world. And God commanded the angels, go forth and help the goodly jinn. And so thus began the jinn war. Good jinn against wicked jinn. And they fought. With the help of the angels, the goodly jinn win. And they drive the wicked ones into the crevices of the world, into the caverns, the ruins, and onto the islands. And the goodly jinn, under Al-Harith, are raised into heaven, where they will praise God alongside humanity. And the most zealous of these praising jinn is this guy named Al-Harith. He worships God day and night, and he is considered to be even great amongst the angels. But then one day, God says, I am going to create another race, humans, fashioned from clay, from dirt. He sends all the angels out to gather the dirts of the world. None of the angels return with the dirt except for the angel of death, Azrael. So there's this beautiful idea that all humans are born with the seed of the grave within them, the dirt of the grave within them, because the angel of death was the one that collected all the clay. And so God creates humanity, and this is when the angels ask the question, do you want to create another creation that will spread corruption? But they obey God. When God says bow before humanity, the angels all bow. But Al-Harith, who is amongst them, says, I refuse to bow. Why should I bow? I am made of fire, and they are made of clay. So the first sort of sin isn't just disobedience of God, it's also supremacy. The arrogance to think that you are better than somebody else is at the heart of this Al-Harith sin. So God says to Al-Harith, raise your arrogant head high. And when Al-Harith does, he casts chains upon him and he crashes into the earth where he becomes Iblis, Shayatan, the devil. So the devil in Islamic cosmology is not an angel, but a jinn who has the free will to do good, who has the free will to do evil, who can make choices just like we can. It is an alternative form of life, that is the jinn, that exists along humanity. Some are good, some are ambiguous, and some are wicked and evil. And the wicked and evil ones are known as the shaitan, Satans. And they're led by this character named Iblis, who was originally raised on high and then crashed to the earth as a result of his arrogance. It's important to understand that Iblis does not wage war on heaven. There is no cosmic war. And Iblis cannot in any way, shape, or form threaten angels or threaten God. He is no threat. He is a minor chieftain of mischief on the earth, allowed to spread corruption until the day of judgment. And this is at the core the Islamic understanding of the devil. The devil is accursed. The devil is a mischief maker. He whispers and leads people astray. But at the end of the day, he is not a great cosmic force and is still under the authority of God and the angels.
That is such a beautiful context and such a beautiful understanding. And that actually leads to a couple listener questions, Dr. Olomi, we have for you. And one is from Michelle Rella Summers, who is asking, hello, Professor Olomi. Some say that jinn are the Islamic version of what Westerners call demons. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Michelle. I would say that they're demons in the classic sense of daemon. That is, that they are sort of tutelary spirit, sort of the genii. They are related towards these family of late antique spirits that emerge in the Mediterranean. Daemons, shadim from the Hebrew tradition, genii, even to a certain extent, perhaps even the lares of the Roman tradition. They have much more in common with those. They're sort of an ambiguous spirit life that exists and acts as an intermediary between the visible world and the hidden world, al-ghaib. What they're not is the medieval Catholic Latin tradition of demon. Some can be demonic. The shaitan are an example of them. They are wicked, they are corrupt, and they spread corruption where they go. The jinn as a whole, however, are more a form of spirit life that exists alongside humanity. Their fundamental purpose is not as the demons are. For example, in the medieval Catholic, we should say, tradition of demons, they are corruptors, they're spreaders of evil, they represent vices, right? So the 7 deadly sins, they represent the manifestation and an expression of evil. The jinn are not. That's not what they represent. The jinn represent that humanity is not alone in this world. That while humanity may be the custodians of this world, the jinn too live here alongside us. So that there must be cohabitation. There must be coexistence with the world of nature. They're more accurately understood as the embodiments of nature, the embodiments of the spiritual life of nature. There's some fascinating stories, one from the Ikhwan al-Safwa, the Brethren of Purity, which talks about how humans once arrived on an island and they immediately began to overhunt. And so the animals of the island took the humans to jinn court. And the jinn arbitrated between the humans and the animals. And the humans were forced to admit that they had gone too far. They were allowed to hunt, but with restrictions, with moderation. So this is the true metaphor of the jinn. They are not a representation of or embodiment of evil in the same way demons are. They're a form of spiritual life. So I would say that they're related to the older concept of daemon and shadim and genii and lares and jinn, rather than the medieval Catholic idea of demon.
You just touched on this too, Dr. Olomi, a few moments ago, that the understanding in the Islamic tradition of the genesis of the jinn is heterodox. For example, we have a listener question for you from Craig Porter. Craig is asking, I've read that there's a tradition that the first jinn created by God was called Jinn long before the creation of humans. Can Dr. Olomi elaborate on this, please?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So there is a bit of debate on what the first jinn really was. Some say it was the entity known as Jan. Others say Jan is just plural for jinn. It's just multiple jinn are known as Jan. So maybe that's what it is. So there isn't a clear explanation here. Most of this is worked out in the commentaries. Again, the Quran is very elusive here. It says that we created man from clay, we created humans from clay, and we created jinn from fire. And that's kind of it. There's some other references to the jinn, right? But in general, the creation, the exploration really comes out of the debates, the commentaries. And so there's a great deal of debate on what is orthodox, what isn't. On the whole, the acceptance is that the jinn were created before humanity. They probably predate humanity and lived on the earth, and they're meant to live alongside humans as an invisible race. That's kind of the basic mainstream. And then there are theologians that will debate it even further. Jinn is considered to be one, perhaps, originator, and there's sort of genealogies that are done. So Iblis is believed to be of the second generation of jinn. Al-Harith is believed to be either the son or grandson of Jinn. So there's whole genealogies in the same way that they do genealogies of Adam and Eve. They do similar genealogies of the jinn. This jinn was probably the father of so-and-so or the son of so-and-so. So that's one explanation. The other explanation is that they were crafted from a source known as Samum. And Samum is this scorching wind, this heat that is uniquely associated with the desert. It's said to penetrate the skin and cause fevers, which is why the jinn are so uniquely associated with things like fevers, illness, and plague. So Samum is considered to be another originator. Some say Samum is a force But there is some that say Samum was the original jinn. We do know that there was an entity known as Samum, perhaps a minor deity or minor jinn character that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia associated with the plague. So that might be another origin. We're not quite clear. There's a great deal of ambiguity and debate. But it's important to note that this debate isn't just in the esoteric tradition. This is not a cult. These are theologians who are debating it. They're having a whole conversation about who the jinn are and where they originate from and tracing out whole genealogies.
You, Dr. Olomi, you have the best Twitter threads.
And that's very kind.
I mean, I am just so thankful. And I know that, thousands of other people are as well. And in one of those threads, you really do an amazing job of laying out the different various domains of the jinn. And of course, we'll make sure to link to those. But can you just share with the listeners, jinn have all of these various domains that they're over too?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. So particularly in the medieval Islamic tradition, the textual tradition that starts to emerge roughly around the 9th century on, 8th to 9th century on, we start to see a desire to classify the world. This is a product of the scientific blossoming that happens in the Islamic world. People start to write cosmographic texts. Al-Khwazwini does it. Even Buni's texts are related to this. This idea that the whole of the world is ordered and you can classify it. Just as we have animal classifications and plant classifications, you could do a similar classification of spirits. And so you have writings of mythic creatures and monsters and beasts and all sorts of entities that are then classified. So this is why this is significant, is to point out that the esoteric and what we would call the magical tradition is deeply related to the scientific and intellectual development of the Islamic world. These were scientists who were writing their classifications, even if their classifications might border on the esoteric. And the jinn are one of those things that end up getting classified. And so there's a variety of different domains that are associated with them. Some of them are divided really kind of in sort of tribal categories. There are certain tribes that exist. And okay, these jinn will rule over this particular place. They'll rule this particular mountain, or they'll rule this particular mountain of Qaf is, for example, considered to be a uniquely mythic place where the jinn rule. Or they'll rule over this particular desert, the jinn of this particular place. But they're also astrologically divided as well. And these become very popular in the Bunian tradition. Ahmad al-Buni is one of the big writers about this. And again, we're not sure if it's Ahmad al-Buni or attributed to Ahmad al-Buni, but he becomes his text really divides up into 7 jinn kings who have multiple domains. They have 7 domains that they rule over or govern. There's Zahuba, who rules over Friday and Venus. There's Maimun, who rules over Saturday and the planet of Saturn. There's Murhab, who rules over the sun and Sunday. And then there's Monday, who's Murah or Al-Abayad. There's some debate here on which one it is. Various texts give a different one. Monday and the moon. Al-Ahmar, who rules over Tuesday and Mars. Barkan, who rules over Wednesday and Mercury, and Shamhurish, who rules over Thursday and Jupiter. And then in turn, each one of these jinn have other jinn that are associated with them, chieftains and whatnot. So the classifications get quite diverse and they get quite complicated. But by dividing up the jinn in this way, they also grant them domains and certain activities. So Zahuba, as the ruler of Friday, and Venus rules over all things musical, rules over all things love and amorous and poetry. And so people who are wanting to do petitions of love or wanting to create love filters or potions or whatnot would work with Zahuba. For those that are looking for powers of alchemy, they would work with Mudhab, who is the jinn of Sunday and a solar entity. So they divide up all the different activities of the world into these 7 astrological domains, which in turn are ruled over by a jinn, and in turn they all are ruled over by a specific angel.
Can you share to that point about how the names of the Jinn King, depending on the source, of course, relates to the planet? So, for instance, Al-Abyad, is the white, or Al-Ahmar might have associations with the red. And then doesn't Barqan means like two lightnings or 2 thunders?
The thunderer, the double thunderer. These names are kind of, and this is common amongst jinn names. Jinn names either are really kind of banal, like Ahmad the Jinn, very kind of simple Middle Eastern names. It's like, oh, who knows Yaqub here? And like, no one knows Yaqub. Oh, he's a jinn, by the way. So there's either like these really banal names of jinns, like ordinary, like Fred the Jinn. Or they have names that are descriptive, that describe what they do. The two-horned one, the thunder. So Barkan is the thunder. Abayad means the white, and so that's why it's associated with Monday, because he's white. Al-Ahmar means red, the red one, which is associated with Mars. Maymun sort of means monkey, or means malformed. The literal definition is monkey, but it means technically malformed, and so that's why it's Saturday. Saturday and Saturn rules over old age, as well as quote unquote what they would call cripples or disabled, right? Like this is the language or the lame is a very common term that they use. So that's why Maymun. There's a description here of each one of these names, and that gives a hint to both the quality of the jinn, the nature of the jinn. So for example, Barkan is known as the thunderer, right? Or the double thunders is what Barkan is known about. And the reason for that is they say, when he appears in a clap of thunder. When he grants you inspiration, you get stunned like you were thunderstruck. These are meant to be descriptions. Al-Ahmar, for example, means red, but also is a reference to a sort of feverish red. So when Al-Ahmar is present, what happens? You are feverish. You end up getting fevers and plagues and illnesses. They're meant to be descriptors, and they give us a little bit of a hint into the nature of what these jinns are. Likely they originated perhaps as older deities or entities or spirits that might have existed, whose names sort of got transmitted over time, or there were appellations associated with the jinn based off of their characteristics.
I know that we've had discussions on the podcast about this before. For example, if you look at the European grimoire, the Heptameron, or the magical elements from 1559, they have 7 quote unquote angels or spirits of the air. But Sunday, for example, paired with Michael is Varkan Rex, which is clearly, as you said, Barkan. Or on Friday, Sarabotres Rex, which is really Zauba. Like there are these amazing relationships of the transmission that really did make it in many ways to the European tradition.
Yeah, I'm a big believer, and there obviously more research has to be done here, but I am a big believer that the Solomonic Grimoire tradition, that those entities were originally jinn, that was a jinnic tradition that likely coexisted alongside the Hebrew tradition, the rabbinic tradition of esotericism. And the evidence for here is that both the Islamic esoteric tradition and the Jewish esoteric tradition kind of emerge roughly in the same cultural milieu, and they influence each other deeply. I mean, you look at some of the language of the Kabbalah, and you look at some of the language of Alboni. I mean, there's some sharing going on there. People are talking to one another. And I believe that then is transmitted and then placed within a Catholic framework. And it is within that Catholic framework that then these entities are transformed into demons. So there's a transmission that's happening. We can do it as a result of etymology. We can do it as a result of linguistics, the language itself. But also, I think in some of the practices, the idea of the Solomonic summoning of these 72 demons, right? That exists in the jinnic tradition. 72 jinn that Solomon had command over. And they have names. And when you look at some of that, you see some overlap. So I think either there was cross-pollination, that they emerged simultaneously with each other or influenced each other to some degree, or that they were probably part of a similar body of late antique practices that were part of the jinn, the shadim, the daemon, etc., that then were Christianized. And in that Catholic medieval tradition, they then become demon kings, or they become either angels or demon kings of some sort.
Professor Olomi, you'll have to tell me if this is Albuni. I cannot remember, but it's so interesting looking at some of the Arabic conjurations where, of course, you see things saying, come by these holy names. And it's, of course, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. But then in the Arabic script, seeing Adonai, like Aleph, Dal, wow. And it's like, wait a second, that's a Hebrew, phrase, but it's in Arabic.
I love this portion of the research, for the record. It's one of my favorite bits, this cross-pollination, because it is fascinating. You see the same thing. If there's a whole body of Hebrew text from Cairo, so cool. If anyone's interested, I think it's called the Genzia Project. Princeton is working on it. Really cool. Check it out. They have a Twitter account. And they tweet out manuscripts. And these manuscripts are by Jewish writers. And they're invoking Allah, and they're invoking Adonai. And you find the same thing among the Muslims. They're writing Ar-Rahman, and then they're writing Adonai. They're totally seeing this magical. Of course you can call God Adonai. Of course you can call God Ar-Rahman. They're looking at each other's traditions and they go, this is the mystery behind the religions themselves. So of course there's a commonality, and they see No tension whatsoever in that. I mean, there's this fascinating bit in this Hebrew text where this is a Jewish person. This is a person who is very openly Jewish who's talking about Jesus and invoking the power of Jesus. And there's no tension. Yeah, of course, we're going to call on the name of Jesus because there's some power there. In other words, there's this understanding that these traditions, at least the people at the time, that there was some similarity. They came from something. They originated from some similar root, some root that then may have taken different paths. And so you can share and exchange with one another in very productive, respectful ways without any real tension. I mean, seeing Hebrew names, seeing Arabic names alongside one another in these texts totally makes sense. I mean, there's some really fantastic work being done on the Jewish seals. In fact, most of us have taken to referring to this period and this period's magic as not Arabic magic, but Judeo-Arabic magic, because they're so similar to one another. And you're going to easily read a text that'll go from Hebrew to Arabic with a blink of an eye, and you don't even worry about it. Like, oh yeah, of course, they're now moving into Arabic and back to Hebrew. So we have some really cool work that's being done on, for example, Judeo-Arabic talismans and seals. The Seal of Solomon is a perfect example of this. The Seal of Solomon, we believe the actual characters involve both Arabic as well as glyphic. There's a star, we believe, and Hebrew letters. And no one saw this as an issue. The Ghayat al-Hakim, for example, has a very famous talisman, and the talisman is a Star of David, 2 triangles. They saw no issue with that. Like, of course, yeah, Jewish magic, great. Part of our tradition too.
Professor Olomi, we have another listener question for you from Craig Porter, who's asking, I believe there is a hadith in which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, asks one of his companions to come with him to see some jinn. He then draws a circle in the sand while reciting something and tells the companion to stay inside the circle until he returns. And Craig's asking, does Dr. Olomi know what the Prophet is said to have spoken while drawing the circle?
I do, but I cannot unfortunately share. It is considered an occult. It's meant to be hidden.
Yes.
It's meant to be hidden. There are certain aspects of the Islamic esoteric tradition that are initiatory, by which I mean you were required to have what's known as an ijaza. It literally means permission in order to know or practice it. So this is important, that while we don't have the same persecution or purging that happens in, say, the Inquisition, the European tradition, in the Islamic world, there is an element of gatekeeping. It does exist. There's certain, for example, texts that you're only allowed to read if you've been initiated, if you've been received the ijaza. Certain words and mysteries that you can only know. This mystery is known. There are esoteric traditions that have talked about it. There is a bit of debate. There's 3 traditions about this. The first is that he drew a line, just a straight line, and told the person to sit on the line. The other is that he drew a circle. And the third is that he drew a letter, a big letter, and told him to sit in it. I can reveal the letter. It's the letter Qaf. If anyone looks up in Arabic, it's kind of circular with the 2 dots at the top. That letter you can know. What he said, I cannot unfortunately repeat, but it is an invocation that then makes its way in the Islamic esoteric tradition. And if you know it, you can then interact with jinn. You either trace out a line, trace out a circle, or the letter Qaf, and then recite this prayer as you do it, this invocation as you do it. And what will happen is that the jinn will then present themselves before this circle, before this line. And it said they will appear in a caravan, one after another, coming before you.
Wow, that is fascinating. And
it's very cool.
Yeah. And to that point, Dr. Olomi, obviously you cannot reveal what is said, but you mentioned that, for instance, as opposed to Europe, for example, which when you look at the Catholic Church and kind of destroying that kind of master apprentice, so to speak, kind of transmission. Yeah. It sounds like what you're saying is, what did the Prophet say? Well, if you are part of a specific lineage, or I'm sure in your extensive travels, you've probably seen and spoken with many people who are part of these lineages.
Yeah. So the idea is that there's a textual tradition that exists, right? And this would be the magical books, catalogs, cosmographic texts, esoteric texts, etc. But that they go hand in hand with an actual living lineage, that it's generally traced back either through Abu Bakr or through Ali, that one of these 2 people will then received the intimate esoteric wisdom of Muhammad, and then they transmitted it down through the ages and their various orders, families, etc., that emerge that will know it. There is an element of guarding even if the textual tradition is open to anyone who can read. It's one of the kind of fascinating moments is the literary tradition of the Islamic world is radically democratic. Social mobility, one of the prime things we see is that if you become a scholar, you can move up in the world. And that's open to anybody. You learn to read, you can move up in the world. And so you could have access to any of these texts. None of these texts are entirely forbidden or taboo even. Most people very openly have massive libraries of these texts. No real issue there. But that alongside them, there is the living tradition of practices, of received wisdom, that is generally sometimes tied to these texts, like how to properly interpret, how to properly pronounce is a big thing that we often see. It's like, okay, you know the word Ar-Rahman and you know the secrets of it, but there's a way of unlocking Ar-Rahman even further through the way you pronounce it, through the various pauses, through the various vibrations, through various even colors. You're supposed to invoke a color, as you say. So there's all sort of mysteries. That then becomes part of a lineage that is somewhat initiatory. It's not fully closed. You can have access to it. You just have to immerse yourself and have some form of ijaza, some form of passing down, some form of lineage teaching, some teacher that says, I will teach you this mystery and I will grant it to you. The trick, however, is that a lot of these people are a little bit guarded and they don't trust anybody. So you have to build trust. That's the key is. And then we could easily get an ijaza or find out these mysteries. They're not as hidden as people might worry. It just involves a little bit of travel, a little bit of sincerity, some trust building, and you're well on your way. Especially if you have access to the texts and with access to these people, you're then fully immersed in the Islamic esoteric tradition.
This next listener question for you, Professor Olomi, is tangentially related to those concepts of trust and tradition. And we do have that listener question from N. And N is asking, hi, Dr. Olomi, can you share knowledge of or stories thereof of jinns who are seemingly attached or close to human families or a familial lineage? And is asking, are they attached to the land in which the family lineage resides? Yes. What is the acceptable method to communicate with them? Thank you, Dr. Olomi. May health be on your side in these transitional years.
Oh, thank you, Anne. That's very kind of you. Yes, this is a really, really cool question. And it goes into an aspect of the Islamic esoteric engagement with the jinn that we don't often talk about, and I don't know if there is a similar concept in Europe. I think the most similar would be the idea of a familiar spirit. That's the closest I can come to. But it is different, very different. So there's three ways that the jinn interact with these lineages, we should say. The first is that they are guardians of the land. They exist as a protector of the land. In those instances, they generally don't have much to do with the humans. They don't meddle. As long as you don't disrupt the land. If you cause damage to the land, then the jinn will react. They will respond. So for example, if you burn down a ruin or you topple over a ruin, then they're like, well, what the F? I'm not sure if I'm allowed to cuss, but what the F, right?
Oh, yeah.
So they get very pissed about stuff like that. Those jinn are very ambivalent towards humans. They're just like these kind of weird creatures that live on our land. As long as they don't mess things up, whatever. The second way that they interact is through ancestral connection. The ancestral connection means that your ancestor is a jinn, that the jinn had some type of sexy time with humans and a hybrid was born, a human jinn hybrid. And then that in turn they had children and it sort of passed down. So there's jinn ancestry in the family. And because the jinn live thousands of lives, that ancestor is generally still alive and will watch over their descendants. Protect, keep them safe, keep an eye on them. They generally can't be contacted. If they want to be contacted, they will do so themselves. Generally in the form of dreams is the common way. This is also, there's some regional differences here. You're going to find more about this sort of jinn ancestry in places like Morocco, North Africa, in the Marabout tradition, in South Asia, and even in Indonesia and Malaysia. You're going to find it less in, say, like the Levantine tradition. There's not a lot in Lebanon. There's some, but just not as much. But this is the idea that there is a jinn ancestor. The second or the third way that they interact is through the pact. Some type of agreement has been made by your ancestor and a friendly jinn. And in turn, that jinn will then watch over and grant its favors over that family. And those favors usually involve like supernatural level of luck, a preternatural level of charisma, sexual prowess, all sorts of like little benefits that you get because the jinn has decided to be, friends with your family. Those are passed down also. But rather than passed down through blood, they're passed down through contract. In some instances, it is a literal contract. I've seen them. It's a literal piece of paper that supposedly the jinn signed. So it's a physical agreement. Other instances, it's an object, some type of ring, some type of a stone, some type of bowl, something that is passed down. Sometimes the ancestors already completed their task. They've done whatever favor they've granted. They helped the jinn out in a tricky situation. They saved their life or something along those lines. In other instances, it requires a bit of a give and take. So the ancestors, your family agrees that they will always leave out a bowl of milk. And so long as they leave out that bowl of milk, the jinn will watch over the family. And when you break the contract, then the jinn is free to break their contract. So these are the three ways that the jinn are interacting with humans through family lineage. One is the property, which they're very ambivalent. 2 is literal blood lineage. And 3 is the contract.
I'm thinking, for instance, of the Quran and the wow in terms of the wow of the oaths, like wal qamar, by the moon. And it sounds like what you're saying is when it comes to a family lineage, it really is about the adherence on both sides, on the human side and the jinnic side, of the adherence to mutually agreed upon terms and a specific oath that is intergenerational, perhaps.
Yeah, the oath is an immensely important aspect of Islamic societies. Oath breaking is considered one of the big no-nos. And you can see it in a lot of the texts that they'll refer to the worst kind of people are adulterers generally, oppressors, and oath breakers. Those are the three, if you do those three things, you violated society. Because society is based off mutual agreement, right? There's some form of social contract we have. So you don't want to be an adulterer because that breaks the family bond, right? That breaks down the family. It's considered a no-no. You don't want to spread oppression or persecution. That's another kind of big problem. It's called zulm in the Islamic tradition. Horrible thing you can do. Don't oppress people if they're the orphan, the widow, the poor, vulnerable, marginalized. Don't do that. That's bad. And you don't want to break oaths because oaths are what keep people together. That's what the sort of ummah is. It's an oath to be one family, one people, one community. And so the oath breaking is a big problem. But it also has a spiritual and esoteric component. You can see it, as you rightly have pointed out, in the Quran. God takes oaths, right? By the moon and the odd numbers, right? So this idea of the oath is very, very important. And in the esoteric tradition, when you make the oath, both sides must agree to it, must maintain it, and as a result will benefit greatly from it. If you maintain the oath, then that's a family that's truly blessed. They have supernatural levels of luck. Things just go their way. Why? Because they're oath keepers. That in of itself grants power.
That leads Dr. Olomi to a listener question that explores the Turkish traditions from Pinar Pigisaglav, who is asking, I get the feeling that the jinn are similar to daemons of the ancient world, in some cases to perhaps the genus Loci. I think they can also be seen as somewhat similar to the various Slavic spirits, such as the domovoi, rusalki, and the Bannic spirits of the bathhouse. Yeah. And Pinar's saying, I do know that in Turkish folklore, the jinn especially love hanging out in bathhouses, bathrooms, and the like. Another interesting thing is most occult workers in Turkey, that is the traditional ones, claim to work with the jinn. Mediums, fortune tellers, spellcasters almost always have such a connection. I wonder, Pinar says, if this perhaps has something to do with the pre-Islamic shamanic beliefs of the Turkic tribes, shamans doing all the work via the spirit helpers, or if it's a more common tradition within the various Muslim communities. Many thanks.
Oh, that's a fantastic question, Pinar. Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the reasons why I argue that the academic study of the jinn are so important. Why? Because it helps us understand how Islam was localized, right? Here's a religion that ends up in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, right? It's in the Sudan, it's in Morocco, it's in Turkey. So how does the religion get localized? And the jinn are a perfect example of that, in which you see these older spirit practices that then are reinterpreted through the lens of the jinn. You can see, for example, in Malaysia and Indonesia, the Orang Bunyan, right? The Orang Bunyan are these spirits that exist, these alternative, almost elf-like entities alternative humans or alternative spirits that exist that are now being interpreted as what? Oh, well, they're jinn. In the Persian and Indo-Persian world, the dev and the pari, they become jinn. So you have these older practices that exists throughout the region that are then Islamized through the language of the jinn. And that's what we see in Turkey, right? The similar older Turkic tribal traditions are then understood through the lens of the jinn. Simultaneously, they do exist in the old Arabian tradition as well. We see the idea of the jinn connection, right? That people can have jinn connections in pre-Islamic Arabia. So Islam allows that to endure. And as it endures, it is then the mechanism by which Islam is localized. The language of these local customs, Islam doesn't wipe these cultures out. It integrates them. It brings them into the fold. It allows a great deal of flexibility. And so local spirits, local entities, local monsters, creatures, spiritual practices, healing traditions are then Islamized. They're understood through the language of Islamic esotericism. They're understood through the language of the jinn. This is one of the reasons why Islam is so successful in spreading, because it allows for that element of flexibility. This is very contrary to how we've been taught Islam spread, right? Spread through the sword, forced conversion, when in actuality, mystics show up and Sufis show up and they start talking and teaching people, and someone goes, oh, well, we have these creatures known as the Orange Bunyan and they exist in the forest. And the Sufis like, oh yeah, that's a jinn. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense to me. They're jinn. So it's a way of really creating flexibility. This is also very different to the way in which Christianity demonizes or infernalizes certain deities, right? So Baal goes from being a certain god to being a demon, right? Baal-zebub, Baal-Tazaboa, the Lord of Hosts, suddenly becomes a monster or a demon. So we see a similar process, but there isn't a moralizing that happens. Those entities aren't suddenly made into evil creatures. You simply go, okay, that creature is a jinn. There's a whole body of work that's done. That's so super fascinating about the way in which Islam interacts in West Africa with indigenous African religions. So what is Islam's relationship to the Orisha, right? The entities that exist that will be part of ATRs, African traditional religions in the so-called New World, is Vodun and Lukumi, but it exists in Benin, right? Who are the Orisha? The Muslims show up, they go, oh yeah, those are the nature jinn. And so you have people who are in these various traditions, the Fula and the Hausa and whatnot, and they go, okay, yeah, they're jinn. So the jinn offer a flexibility to integrate local beliefs, practices, and spirits into the Islamic cosmology. It's very fascinating work.
Yes, again, striking on that theme of an incredible amount of integration, beautiful amount of absorption and tolerance and heterodoxy that is definitely exactly not found. I mean, I'm thinking in one of the 72 spirits listed in the Lemegetans of Goetia is Astaroth, going back to Astarte, the goddess.
So a similar concept of demonization or transforming them into the infernal, we don't see. I mean, even local shrines, like, oh, this is a shrine where we find healing. We find this all throughout North Africa in the Marabout tradition, these various local shrines of sort of spirits/saints. There might have been real historic people that were like saintly figures, and others that maybe they were spirits of some sort. They become jinn shrines. They're not abolished, they're not destroyed, they're not demonized. They simply go, oh, this is where the jinn hang out. Go and put your prayer flag there for healing. So it's a way in which local customs and practices endure, even as the religious hegemony changes, right? Islam becomes the dominant religious cosmology, but it simultaneously preserves local custom and practice.
When we think about jinn, therefore, Dr. Olomi, what are comprehensively 2 or 3 things that people commonly misunderstand about the jinn that you wish they should always keep in mind? Or what are 2 or 3 things that they should keep in mind when engaging with source works for the jinn or reading about the jinn?
Yeah, so a couple things. First and foremost is that the jinn aren't just spirits, right? It's the kind of theme I'm trying to harp on. They're not just entities like shadowy figures that you invoke and that's it. No, they have lives. They have children, they have families. They're a form of alternative spirit life. So while, yes, they exist as a sort of spirits as we imagine them in a sort of modern language of spirits, they also are much more related to an alternative form of life. That idea of spirit is older and more prevalent in the sort of post-Catholic, post-Protestant idea of spirit. from the Shi to the various entities that was mentioned brilliantly by Pinyar. Those ideas all are very similar to the Jinn. So in other words, the concept of the Jinn is far more common in global folk traditions and spiritual practices than our Western idea of the demon or of the spirit. So I think that's very important to understand, that the Jinn in many ways reflect both this older understanding, but also an understanding that still continues in most places in the world. That the framework of demon and spirit isn't the only way of understanding the hidden world. The Jinn offer an alternative way of understanding that, of saying, okay, these are entities that coexist simultaneously with us, whether they're a household spirit that will fix your shoes, or they're the Shi of the Nordic traditions, or the elves of the Nordic tradition, or the fairies of the Nordic. They have much more in common with those entities and beings than they do with, I should say, demons in that sense. So they're an alternative way of understanding spirit life. That's the first kind of big takeaway. The next big takeaway is academically, they offer us a great deal to understand how Islam interacted with local culture. So one of the things I highlighted here is that integration process. It pushes back on overly simplistic and reductive understandings of Islamic history. It's why it's important for us to study this academically. It's not just an esoteric tradition for initiates and people who are into the mysteries, but this is why we should have more and more academics studying Jinn, more and more academics studying these aspects, because it helps us understand a more nuanced history. And then third, a bit of advice for those who are interested in dealing with things like Jinn and whatnot is to, one, know the culture, know the history, know the customs. Don't treat this like a spiritual slot machine. You memorize a couple invocations, you plug it in, and you hope you get results or whatnot. Everyone's personal spirituality is up to them. I'd never tell people what to do in that regard, whether to believe in magic or not believe in magic or practice or not. That's none of my business, right? I practice the ancient art of minding my fucking business. And so it's entirely up to you. But if you are involved in that sort of stuff, learn the culture, learn the history, learn the cultural context. Don't treat it like a spiritual slot machine, and always keep your promises. You do not want to break oaths.
That is so beautiful. And for people who maybe decide capriciously, I'm going to summon demons, and they open up something like the Lemegeton's Goetia, and they're shocked because they think that, this is some kind of infernal thing where there's an exchange of souls. One of the first things that it says is, okay, you need to make sure that you are pure. And other grimoires say, go to confession, fast for 9 days, pray to God. And these people who just wanted, quote unquote, wanted to work with demons, quote unquote, are like shocked that there is all this work, as you said, on the self, on understanding where these things come from. It's just so ironic sometimes.
Oh, no, so true. I mean, I remember a friend of mine who was totally taken aback because we were very shaped by the Faustian image, right? The image of selling your soul. And he was very disappointed. He's like, I was ready to sell my soul. I'm like, oh, that's a problem right then and there.
Oh, jeez.
But this was a sort of a young rebellion. He was going through a bit of a young rebellious stage. There is a whole tradition of, being subversive and whatnot. So there was this idea of, there was some form of subversive power here. But in actuality, most of this tradition is deeply related to spiritual development and evolution, and you being a pious, being a believer. That's a very big, important component of it. I should note that, as I mentioned, that there is no concept of selling your soul in the Islamic world. The soul cannot belong to anyone other than God. So there's none of that actually exists in the Islamic world. But it is fascinating. I remember when we discussed Buni in class, it was very different because we come from the idea of magic as like spells and incantations. And then they're like, wait a minute, you have to fast for 6 months and then pray and then do an ablutions. This doesn't sound like magic to me. Like, well, this is kind of the problem. Our understanding of magic is filtered through a very small cultural lens. But when you go into these sources, even the medieval European sources, it's very different than what you imagine. It's very different.
For instance, in Islamic talismanic consecratory procedures, this isn't just something you do casually on a Saturday night. This is months and months and months, and you must recite verses from the Quran, hundreds of times, and then every single day matching the phase of the moon. I mean, it's just so many things that are theurgistic, that are working on the nefs, on the soul, as much as it is achieving some kind of practical, magical end.
Absolutely. Well, there's two kind of approaches to talismans, right? So there's the naturalistic approach, which we find in Ghayat al-Hakim. And even in that naturalistic approach, which doesn't take months and months and months, it requires a great deal of correspondence. What you're doing is you're ensouling this object by tapping into that specific moment and time. And that involves what? Knowledge of the stars, knowing what time it is, what day it is. I mean, sometimes some of these talismans, like, okay, you got to wait till Jupiter's in Pisces. Well, Jupiter goes into Pisces, like, you got to wait a year plus. And then you got to deal with retrogrades, right? It's like right now, Jupiter's in Pisces, but it's going to go retrograde for the rest of the year until December. So if you were planning on creating a Jupiter in Pisces talisman, your window is closing. You're going to have to wait till next year, or December, I think, is when it finally ingresses back into Pisces. There's a great deal of timing involved, a great deal of knowledge that's involved. And then you got to be able to know which materials are using. If you're working with Jupiter, you better be working with that tin, right? You got to know the symbols, the prayers. You got to know the secret names. What are you going to call? You're going to say, what's up, Jupes? You're going to bless this talisman? No, you got to call him by his secret names. You got to know him as Jove. You've got to know him as Mishtari. You got to call him by these. That's the naturalistic approach. Then you have the Boonian approach, which is even more spiritual, which is deeply rooted in the idea that you are quite literally peering into the building blocks of the universe. And if you're going to work with the building blocks of the universe, then you must be spiritually pure. It takes months of prayer and fasting and purifying and knowing. I mean, you're working out mathematics. You're working out the mathematical sums of these secret letters and these names, and then combining them in unique and complicated ways. So this is not what if you're expecting to light a candle and you're going to get a cash bonus the next month, you probably should look more towards natural magic than the magic of Booni, because it's a deeply spiritual practice. It was seen in many ways as a discipline, not just magic, but as a discipline that would then discipline the soul and uplift it. Now, the benefit of that is that in addition to doing all those elaborate rites, when you elevate the soul, you are then granted power. So that, yes, you can create talismans, but you can also perform miracles and wonders, like the laying of hands, or, all sorts of other things that, like Bastami is granted the ability to fold, which is transporting yourself massive distances in a short span, folding space and time. So all sorts of miracles are then possible. But how do you get to that point? Well, dedication. In many ways, not too dissimilar from Abramelin the Mage.
That also leads Dr. Olomi to a question about some of the materia magica, so to speak, and techniques. So, for example, in the quote unquote Western tradition, one of the most often discussed things is crystallomancy, for example, or, the working of drawing spirits into crystals. Does Islamic esotericism in Al-Buni or in any of the sources employ the use of scrying devices like a crystal sphere or a black obsidian mirror, for example, in order to contact spirits or to contact jinn?
Yeah, there are magic mirrors do exist in the Islamic tradition. We believe, if I'm not mistaken, the magic mirror is likely Jewish in origin, adopted then by Christian esotericism and Islamic, we believe, or probably, and of course, predates it in the Hellenistic world, right? Scrying, looking into pools of water, predates it, but then is adopted into the Jewish tradition and then spread. But it does exist. It's not uniquely associated with spirit contact, though. So, for example, the setting up of the scrying mirror in order to see entities or conjure spirits, it does exist. The sort of scrying ink is one way it's done, a pool of black ink in which spirits are invoked into it. But it's not the primary focus of scrying. Scrying and magic mirrors are used for a variety of things. For seeing the future, spying is a very common one. Enchantment is another one. There's a whole body of magic mirror techniques in which you create a magic mirror in order to create glamours, to change your physical appearance, or to enchant people. So there's a very famous magic mirror that's created out of silver and worked with a lunar talisman. It's a lunar mansion working, and it allows you to enchant people. So like you gain influence over them, or ability to sort of influence their mind and soul, or increase your charisma. That's probably the most famous magic mirror. The other use is communication, to communicate into people's dreams, to enter dreams, to speak over long distances and influence people's minds. Those are the more common uses of magic mirrors as sort of talismanic magical objects. The use of contacting them for spirits exists, but it's a little bit of a minor tradition. It's not the most important way of contacting spirits. Mostly when you contact angels and jinn, it's generally done through incense. Incense is the big one. You create pellets of incense that are then burned in a brazier, and then the entity will appear out of the incense. That's the most common way of spirit contact or dreams, is the other one. The scrying mirror is used for sort of other things, but it does exist. There's a small thread of it, an Egyptian thread, in which you invoke spirits into a pool of black ink.
That kind of leads into a listener question we have for you, Dr. Olomi, from Kat, who is asking, could you please ask Professor Olomi about Al-Khidr and the role of Al-Khidr in the lives of Moses and other biblical figures, as well as Dr. Olomi's thoughts on Al-Khidr's relation to green man traditions?
Oh, yeah, that's a very cool question, Kat. Thanks for asking that. I did do a thread on Al-Khidr. He is a complicated character. He's sort of elusively referred to in the Quran as the teacher of Moses. So the idea is that Moses is told at one point that he needs a teacher. And so he's told to go to a place in which two types of water meet, sweet and salty, and that he will find this person. And he finds them, this man who's dressed in Al-Khidr. Al-Khidr just means the green one, or the green man. And at first, Al-Khidr is very reluctant to take him on as a teacher. So, I'm not taking you on. I don't want you as my student. But Moses pleads and begs, all right, fine, I'll take you on as a student under one condition. You cannot ask me any questions. No questions whatsoever. And Moses is like, no props. I got this. This is easy. So they need to start out on their journey, and they arrive at this water port, and they need to get across. So these sailors very kindly offer to take them across. And Moses and Al-Khidr are like, all right, thanks. They get on board. They travel across the body of water. When they get off, Al-Khidr takes his staff and he strikes the ship, damaging it. And Moses goes, what are you doing? These people just helped us out, and you're punishing them? You're hurting them? And he's remember your promise. And Moses kind of grumbled, okay, all right, I remember my promise. So then they go and they travel. They end up in a village, and they arrive at this village, and they're taken in by these two hospitable figures with a young baby boy. And they give him food, they give him water, they give him shelter, they perform the right guest rites. And so Moses and Al-Khidr are very thankful. And right as he's about to leave, Al-Khidr kills the baby. And Moses is like, you have got to be kidding me. What are you doing? You just killed this baby. These people, they've taken care of us. They've given us the guest rights. You violate. Remember your promise. And Moses goes, okay, all right, I remember my promise. Finally, they come to another village, and they're traveling. And this village is just miserable. They're horrible. They're not hospitable. They're cruel. And in response, what does Al-Khidr do? He repairs their broken wall. And this is when Moses just can't take it anymore. He goes, you have got to be kidding me, Al-Khidr. You punish the sailors that help us. You kill the baby of the family who takes us in. But here you work in service of these cruel, inhospitable people. And Al-Khidr finally says, this is where we part ways, for you have broken your promise. But before we leave, I will impart on you wisdom. I damaged the ship of those sailors because the sailors were part of a kingdom in which a horrible king was going to conscript all the ships in a war. I saved them from that war. I killed that child because those two parents were righteous, and the child will grow up to become an oppressor. Remember, oppression is the worst thing you can do, right? He would become an oppressor. A new, better, more righteous child would be brought to this family. And I repaired this wall, even though the village was jackasses to us, because underneath this wall is a glorious treasure that belongs to an orphan. Now that treasure will be safe until they're adults. So the whole idea is that God works in mysterious ways. And Al-Khidr represents the ability to see beyond surface facts, beyond what is happening, to see the esoteric, the hidden. He becomes one of the most important figures in Islamic esotericism. The three big figures are Prophet Idris, who is said to be the forefather of astrology, geomancy, whatever, all the kind of mystical sciences. Al-Khidr, who is supposed to be the initiator, who initiates you into the Islamic esoteric tradition. And Suleiman, the prototypical mage, the person who represents the manifestation of all that power. He's also fascinating from a cultural perspective because he does represent cross-cultural exchange. He is associated in the Levantine tradition, particularly in Palestine and in Lebanon and Jordan, with St. George, the slayer of dragons. And so St. George's Day is the day of Al-Khidr. In India, there are various shrines that are associated with him where people will go and pray. And some of these likely were indigenous local shrines that already existed, but then were repurposed. So Al-Khidr once with the spread of Islam. He has been associated with the green man in some local customs. He's also been associated with the figure or the power of Pisces because he's said to ride on a fish of some sort. So he's a mysterious figure. He is the ultimate initiator. A lot of ink has been spilled on who he is. We don't know the exact details. We don't know all of it. We just know that he exists. He is a teacher of prophets. He's believed to be alive still. Once a year, he's supposed to meet up with the other living prophet, Prophet Elias. He meets him, or Elias. He meets them in Mecca, and the two have a robust conversation, and then they go their separate ways. But he is a very important aspect of Islamic esotericism.
Wow, that is so fascinating. And I've seen discussions online and elsewhere by esotericists who are, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this at all, but there's almost a strive to kind of look at the registers of spirits and kind of occultism in general and try and come up with a materialistic scientific explanation, like saying, I am going to go out there and prove that all of the angels and Jibreel are actually, multidimensional beings located in the ninth dimension, or I'm going to prove that there's some kind of alien connection. But I think what you're saying with Al-Khidr is this really goes back to the root of the word occult, which is to be hidden, to embrace the ghaib, to embrace the mystery. Is that somewhat fair?
Oh, that's absolutely fair. I think you're hitting the nail on the head with that. There is certainly within an idea, and I should note that we shouldn't fall into the other category that everything equals everything, right? Sometimes we end up seeing that Ar-Rahman is actually Hathor, who's really Astarte, that also can sometimes be misleading. So there's these two prongs that exist, an attempt to try to link everything to everything without any cultural context, right? Ignoring the fact that these things are shaped by a historical moment. They're shaped by their material conditions. But then the reverse is also true, that the overly materialistic interpretation, which tries to definitively answer this entity is blank, or it's an alien, and I think that misses it. These are fundamentally understood as mysteries. You are meant to sit with those mysteries. You're meant to meditate on those mysteries. You're meant to sort of reflect on them and accept that there are limits to what we can know, that some things are hidden, that even though you are initiated and you learn the mysteries, there will be certain aspects that it is what it is. And that is part of the beauty of this sort of esoteric tradition, that it creates, there is a limit of knowledge. It allows you to really dive into truly the hidden, right? Building blocks of life, the meaning of spirit, all of these things, but also the recognition that at some point you simply have to sit with the mystery, accept that there is some things like, who is Al-Khidr? We probably will never know, right? Is he St. George? Sure. Is he the green man? Sure. Is he something entirely different? Sure. All of those are true. And we can sit with that complexity. We can sit with that nuance. We can sit in those mysteries and simply accept them for what they are.
What an excellent reminder to bathe in the strangeness, to embrace the mystery. And as you mentioned, speaking of mystery, Dr. Olomi, you mentioned that, of course, a lot of these traditions, they are traditions where you have to be initiated. And so not everything might be written down. And this goes to a listener question for you from Damien, who is asking, can Dr. Olomi point to any sources of historical accounts or records of Islamic practitioners of magic and working evocations?
Yeah. So there are records of magic being done. Like we have evidence of it being done. The most, I think, comprehensive would probably be Ibn Khaldun's work. Ibn Khaldun goes, even though Ibn Khaldun himself is a skeptic, he's got an awkward relationship with magic. I think he believes in it, but it makes him uncomfortable. So he's got like this really weird relationship, but he records a lot. He records predictions. He records like so-and-so made this prediction, so-and-so did that. He records various magical activities. So-and-so conjured this and so-and-so did that. Muhammad al-Tabasi also does it. He writes extensively. In fact, he talks about a very famous jinn conjuring that happened in public in Baghdad. We also have, of course, records in various astrological texts as well of predictions, talismans, etc., that worked, right? Like so-and-so made this talisman and it worked. For example, Shadan, who writes about Abu Mashar, talks about a very famous miracle worker that arrives in Baghdad, and Al-Ma'mun, the Khalif, tests the miracle worker because he claims to have miraculous powers. And one of the miraculous powers is that he has a magic ring that only he can wear. And anybody else who wears it will immediately fall into fits of laughter that they can't control until they bowl over, right?
Uh-huh.
And he's like, he demonstrates it. He shows the ring and the person wears it and the person can't. So it's a demonstration of real magical power. And so Al-Ma'mun tests his astrologer. He goes, what is he doing? How did he be able to do this? Is he a mystic? Is he God granted this power? And Abu Masha casts an interrogational chart. And he goes, Mercury is in Scorpio. The man is a liar. His magic is talismanic magic. It's not miracles. And the man confesses, yes, these are two magic stones that I created in a particular astrological moment that only I am allowed to wear. So his magic is sort of revealed to a certain extent. So yeah, we have all sorts of various records of it. And then we also have, of course, texts that talk about these various magical works that you can learn from. The two most famous, of course, are the Ghayat al-Hakim and the text Shams al-Marif of Buni. These are the two that probably are the most detailed. And the Ghayat al-Hakim, their Latin translations exist. Dan Angelology, his Latin translation is phenomenal. Just did a brilliant job of the Latin Picatrix version of it. Dr. Liana Saif, who is like genius level here, is working on a translation from the Arabic. She's been tweeting about it, and like the level of manuscripts that she's collected is just like mind-bogglingly impressive. So that's going to be very cool. We will see the Ghayat al-Hakim translated in our lifetimes. So they do exist, these magical texts that both either teach magic or record various magical acts that have happened, either from the perspective of practitioners or from the perspective of skeptics and historians like Ibn Khaldun.
Yes, that was so great to have Dan and Dr. Saif on the podcast too to talk about that. I think we are all exactly eagerly awaiting Dr. Saif's work as well as everything.
She's a brilliant translator. In addition to, like my brilliant scholar in general, in addition to working on the Ghayat al-Hakim, her next project is on the Jabarin corpus, Jabir is considered to be the most famous Islamic mage. So that's like never been translated before. So this is like everything she does is exciting. The Ghayat al-Hakim is exciting, but I'm also excited for her next project. So keep your eye out. Dr. Liana Saif is like breaking barriers.
That is something we will certainly make sure to keep a lookout for with bated breath. And actually, Dr. Olomi, this touches on something you just mentioned, one of the texts, and it's a listener question from Douglas of What Magic Is This? And Douglas is asking Dr. Olomi, of course, it has to be asked, I haven't heard about any progress in years, but will a full English translation of the Shams al-Ma'arif or the Book of the Son of Gnosis appear at any point? And I know a few people who are attempting this, but I just, of course, your expertise would be great.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Douglas, and something that I think everyone is looking for. I think the answer is yes, but in time. The problem is that everyone has started it, has kind of given up at some point because it is a difficult text to get through. And particularly critical editions. There's a lot of contradictions from manuscript to manuscript. So it is quite hard to translate if you're going to do a critical edition of it that is complete. It is difficult to do. The second is that Shams al-Marif is another one of those sort of initiatory traditions. There's an element of like, you need to know the know if you want the Shams al-Marif to work for you. Ghayat al-Hakim, I should say, is much more accessible in this way. Shams al-Marif is not. I've gone through the text, I've read it, I reread it a lot, and it is a very difficult text. He's very elusive in some of the things. Sometimes he's very like literal. He's like, all right, when Venus is in Jupiter, make this magic square on white silk. Very straight up, gives you instructions. You're like, okay, thanks. But then other times he's like, you must know the mystery of the letter Qaf. And you're like, well, what does that mean? How do I understand it? So there is an element of like, to translate it will require, I think, a balance of a really disciplined or person who's part of maybe the discipline of Buni and a person who's academic. It requires a good deal of academic critical work. I do think it's possible. Two things. One, I hate to mention the Patreon. I'm not overly fond of self-promotion, but I have translated some of the talismans. So if you're interested, direct the talismanic works of it, some of the words of power, some of the secret names, I have translated them. They're available with full instructions, very clear images of what the magic squares look like, what the talismans look like, some of the magical operations. I think the last one I did was a magic square to gain the favor of the Jinn. So very fitting for this particular podcast, but also lunar mansion talismans, etc. I don't intend to do a full translation because I'm on the tenure line. So I've got other cool projects that are keeping me busy, and I don't have the time to give it the justice that it deserves, the attention that it really deserves. But maybe someday I will. When I get tenured and I have a little bit more wiggle room, I might go back. And it is a project I'm very interested in. I've translated fragments. I'm interested in seeing a full translation of it because I think this knowledge should be accessible. It's important to keep this stuff alive. So I hope so. I do believe so. And it is also hopefully a plea to anyone who is interested in Islamic esotericism. I don't think there has ever been a moment in history where the academy is more open to the idea. This is a great time. If you want to get your PhD and translate the Shams al-Maraf, come and join us on the dark side. It's a good time for this. Dr. Liana Saif, Matthew Melvin Al-Khrouchi, and Noah Gardner have really opened up the doors, I think, in Islamic esotericism. I mean, Charles Burnett as well. So I think this is a perfect time for anyone who's interested, who really wants to do a translation. Come and join us. I think you'll be welcome.
Listeners, we will make sure to check out the video description and the podcast description for a link to Dr. Olomi's Patreon as well. And I think that's such a beautiful urging because I know that there's an Arabic theurgy and magic group on Facebook where someone's walking through it as well. And then definitely check out Dr. Olomi's Patreon for that as well and more in-depth translations of specific sections. And that kind of leads to, in general, do you see Islamic esotericism, Dr. Olomi, gaining a wider acceptance or understanding either in Muslim majority or non-Muslim majority parts of the world? I mean, obviously your work and others is really helping to build those bridges, but how do you see it happening in recent years or in future years?
Yeah, I do think it is gaining traction to some extent. Where it will lead to, as Muslims say, Allahu Alam, God only knows. I should say that Islamic esotericism is a living tradition. It still exists. It's not that hidden. Any country you go to, I mean, I challenge anyone to go to Morocco and walk away thinking that Islamic esotericism is dead. Go to India. I challenge you to walk away thinking that no one believes in the Jinn or their interaction with humans. It's still a very clear living tradition. There are still talisman makers. There's still Jinn conjurers and Jinn binders. They're very much a living tradition that goes all the way back to the medieval roots. It's still around. Families still practice it. I think people forget that Saudi Arabia is not the Islamic world. The only place where you're going to see real massive pushback and backlash is in Saudi Arabia. That's the whole beheading of sorcerers or people being accused of sorcery. That's there. But in general, it's still pretty ordinary Muslim lives are different from the way in which public perception views it. The public perception, which is shaped, I should say, by political interests, by pundits, by Orientalist academics who are invested in a sort of orthodox tradition that exists, and of course, religious scholars who, as a part of the sort of colonial modernity, are also imagining a pure Islamic orthodoxy that has existed from time immemorial. In actuality, the lived experience of Islam is heterodox. The lived experience of Islam is complicated and nuanced. And Islamic esotericism has always been close to the heart of Islam throughout its history and remains a living tradition, even as the sort of public discourse has changed around it. So maybe it's not treated as a science anymore, and there's much more of a pushback from Orthodox scholars who are trying to preserve their own personal authority. But any village, any city, any town, you could find astrologers, you can find miracle workers and healers and whatnot still there. What is interesting though is that the younger generation, Muslims within these communities, are even more open-minded. I think the millennial generation and the Gen Z generation are turning more and more away from institutions of knowledge that have failed them, whether it's the academy or the masjid or whatever that fail to sort of meet their needs. And we see quite recently, Black Lives Matter, right? The failure of certain religious institutions to step up and speak truth to power in those moments. Young Muslims are looking for guidance. Young Muslims are looking for leaders who are going to speak up and speak to their social conditions. And so as a result, they have turned to alternative ways of knowing. This is why I think we've seen a resurgence of astrology amongst the younger generations around the world, right? Whether Gen Z or millennials, it's a big belief in astrology. And we see it certainly among Muslims. I see more and more young Muslims who are open-minded, who are curious, and who are now going, wait a minute, this tradition exists in Islam as well. That, okay, I grew up knowing that I was a Scorpio or whatever, but Al-Aqrab also exists. Oh, I thought I was a Leo, but Al-Assad also exists. And so they're reconnecting to their roots, and the esoteric tradition is helping them to do that. We are seeing a more academic, when we think non-Muslim countries, we are seeing a more academic openness to the study of these topics in anthropology, in history, in religious studies. As we move away from a sort of simplistic Orientalist framework, there is more diverse interests in Islamic intellectual traditions. Historians of science who work on astrology, historians of religion who work on esotericism. Whether that will filter into the broader public, I don't know. I think there's still a good deal of resistance among some people who are in esoteric circles, some level of prejudice that Islam's esotericism is somehow not equal to or on par to the grimoire tradition. Oh, they don't really have magic. They have sort of this other superstitious stuff. We see similar language around a variety of different other types of magic as well, or esoteric traditions. A sort of hesitancy. If it's not a grimoire, it's not that good. But I do also see things opening up a little bit, whether it'll filter in even more and we'll see more people, who knows, in a few years, you'll see people who openly admit that they're into the Islamic esoteric traditions. Maybe, but there is something changing and we are living in those changing times.
Can you, Dr. Olomi, give the listeners any hints on any upcoming projects or research or writings, anything else that maybe we should be keeping our ear to the ground on? For instance, I remember you just said a few moments ago that you really would love to do, say, a full translation of the Shams al-Ma'arif, but obviously there are other things that you are working on. So is there any hints or anything we can?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm working on a couple really interesting projects. As all academics are, we are juggling multiple things. One of the projects that I'm sort of concluding now is on the first astrologer queen of the Islamic world, Queen Bauran. So that's going to be interesting. That's going to manifest itself as an article, which I will, of course, make very publicly available. I'm a very big believer in making things as open as possible. I'm also working on 2 books, and I can give hints about that without giving away too much. But one of the books will be on the Jinn, a full exploration of the history of the Jinn in esoteric traditions, full catalog of Jinn names, Jinn practices, full on everything you've ever wanted to know about the Jinn will be in this text. And the second will be a little bit more academic and is rooted towards the Islamic intellectual tradition. It's called The Making of the Islamic World, where I will argue that the esoteric tradition and astrology is one of the cornerstones of how Muslims imagined a unified territorial unit called the Islamic world, which would then be picked up in the 19th century concept of Watan, this sort of anti-colonial movement, is rooted in this much older idea that the Islamic world is a product of sort of astrological texts, esoteric texts, that it's not just Muslim political thinkers, but it is these Muslim esoteric thinkers that are creating this territorial unit known as the Muslim world. And then, of course, there is going to be a text dedicated to astrological history, what people call mundane astrology, that will look at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So those are the kind of main works that I'm doing right now. But in the future, you can expect more on astrology, more on magic, more on Jinn as I expand and explore further.
Well, congratulations, Dr. Olomi. Now you have myself and thousands of listeners salivating over here, just waiting for that is amazing. We will certainly keep our ear to the ground on that. Dr. Olomi, amid the menagerie of other projects and everything else that you're working on, also one of the most fruitful and just engaging and fascinating series that you have is your Head on History podcast. What was the genesis of the Head on History podcast? Like what inspired you to start it and what is it all about?
Thank you. Yeah, very kind of you to compliment. It's a weird project. I'll say that very openly. Podcasting is funky and weird and fun, and it allows you a lot of kind of wiggle room. But the genesis of it was really, I had started it as a distillation of my classes. So I had originally envisioned Head on History as a way for students to be able to listen to supplementary material or learn from the lecture in case they missed a day. And I went, okay, these classes are fun. These are interesting. And I'm getting really good feedback from students. Why shouldn't I make these classes readily accessible for the public? Why hide behind, registration fees and enrollment and the walls of the ivory tower? I'm a big believer in accessibility. Make it as open as possible. Make knowledge accessible. If I had it my way, I would tear down the walls of the ivory tower and let everybody attend whatever classes they want, right? Just let the public flood into the academy. It's good for all of us. It's good for society. So I saw it as a sort of public good, as a public service, as I'm going to make this stuff available. I'll take my classes, obviously not the PowerPoints, but make it as accessible as possible. Talk about Islamic history, talk about world history, world religions. And then from there, I developed it around my research interests: Islamic occultism, Islamic astrology, or astrology from the Islamic world, magic, jinn, a political Islam. All these topics really kind of developed from this initial genesis of I want to make my classes readily available for people. And it's so far been quite fun and enjoyable. I have reworked it a little bit. It used to be a 10-episode podcast done seasonally. Now it's monthly. So it is really just a way of saying, look, there's some really cool research that's being done. There's some really cool teaching that's being done. Let's make it as widely acceptable as possible. I really wanted people to find a way to engage with Islamic history, Islamic thought, without feeling like they needed to fall into the trap of polemics, right? People who are either doing apologia or people who are doing polemic writings or whatnot, to find a sort of place where you can have nuanced conversations, nuanced debates, and really look at the complexity of Islamic history in all its varied forms, not just mainstream, this is the beginning of Islam, this is where we are today, but also look at the twists and turns of Islamic thought. What is Al-Ghazali talking about? Where does astrology fit into this? Where does geometry fit into all of this? So it's all about accessibility, and that was the genesis of it. Fortunately, people have liked my little weird nerdy podcast. It's going quite well.
Yes, absolutely. And we will certainly make sure to link to that. Yeah, it's such a wonderfully elucidating podcast. Yes, Dr. Olomi, for sure. And of course, we'll make sure to link listeners. Check out the video description to support Dr. Olomi on Patreon, which is just a wonderful way to show support. And Dr. Olomi, too, of course, I think everyone on the planet should be following you on Twitter. But for those few people who are not following you on Twitter, can you tell us where can they find you on Twitter or anywhere else they can find you as well?
That's very kind. I always tell people whenever I meet people in person and they're like, I follow you on Twitter, my immediate response, I'm so sorry. Twitter is a hell site. It's a weird place. Yeah. But if you wish to punish yourself and you are a masochist like the rest of us, then you can find me at AAOLOMI. AAOLMI, yes. It's just my two initials, AA and then Olomi. And I do kind of Wednesday threads, but bear in mind that if you come for the Wednesday threads, you must stick around for the radical politics and the shit talking that I do, generally directed at politicians and whatnot. But I can give you some consolation, and that is that I will always tweet out cat pictures. A little bit of a mix there.
The variance of the threads that you have is just so amazing. So I'd certainly encourage listeners, please, if you have not already, definitely check out Professor Olomi on Twitter. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on yet? Or is there anything else that you just like to leave listeners with, either about Islamic esotericism or Quranic theurgy or anything along those lines?
Yeah, sure. I should mention that we talked about jinn and angels, but there are other entities that are sort of in ambiguous places. And this might be a conversation for another time, but there are the muwakkil, who are, some say are jinn and some say are angels, but we don't know. They're not definitively defined, but they are entities or spirits associated with the names and letters of God. They're considered to be the custodians of the Quran, the protectors of the secrets of the Quran, the hidden Quran, so to speak, the letters, the numerology, the letterist approach to it. And they are also associated with the Islamic esoteric tradition, and many sort of esoteric peers or sages or mages or Sufis will claim to have some type of connection to this muwakkil characters. There's also the ruhaniya, which are planetary spirits. And again, it is unclear if they're angels or jinn, but they also exist. So Islamic esotericism is really complicated. There's a lot of nuance and really cool depth to it. And I'm excited to see people dive into it and explore it in their own ways.
An invitation, as Dr. Olomi says, to bathe in the strangeness, delve into the sources, and discover all of the very fascinating cross-pollinations. It is just so wonderful. Historian of Islam in the Middle East with a specialized focus on esotericism, magic, folklore, and astrology, Dr. Ali A. Olomi. Dr. Olomi, thank you so much just for taking the time to share your time and your wisdom and coming on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. This was a very fun conversation. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Listeners, I hope you appreciated the wisdom, generosity of spirit, and elucidations that Dr. Olomi shared as much as I did. His points about embracing the ghaib, or the unseen, in occult workings is so needed, as well as Dr. Olomi's constant urging to break down the barriers of misunderstanding and constantly learn and grow. It's a message that we need now more than ever. And how exciting is it that Dr. Olomi is also working on, among his many other projects, a comprehensive Jinn book as well. So exciting. So definitely check out the links below to support Dr. Olomi on Patreon, and also to find his Twitter page and other information. And as always, a huge, big thank you to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your wonderful questions and your support. And if you'd like to support Glitch Bottle and get exclusive perks, please consider hopping on the Glitch Bottle caravan yourself at patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.